J'ouvre maintenant la séance. Bienvenue à la réunion numéro 129 du Comité permanent des comptes publics de la Chambre des communes. Today's meeting is taking place in hybrid format, pursuant to the standing orders. Members are attending in person in the room and remotely using the Zoom application. I'd like to ask all members and other in-person participants to consult the cards on the table for guidelines to prevent audio feedback incidents. And a reminder to those using the earpiece to keep the earpiece away from the microphone at all times. When you're not using your earpiece, please place it face down on the sticker on the table for this purpose, usually to your right. Occasionally the sticker's on the left. Conformément à l'article 108.3G du règlement, le comité reprend l'examen du...
Pursuant to Standing Order 108.3G, the committee resumed consideration of Report 2, Housing and First Nations Communities 2024. Reports 2 to 4 of the Auditor General of Canada referred to the committee on Tuesday, March 19th, 2024.
Patty Hajdu, PC, MP, Minister of Indigenous Services. Nice to see you again, Minister. Along with several officials from your Department of Indigenous Services. Gina Wilson, Deputy Minister. Paula Hayden Jokiel, Assistant Deputy Minister. Tom Wong, Chief Medical Officer, Chief Science Officer, and Director General. And Nelson Barbosa, Director General, Regional Operations. Minister, you'll have 5 minutes for your opening remarks, after which we'll proceed to a round of questioning. Over to you, please.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and thank you very much, everyone, for the opportunity to come here with my officials to talk about what I think is a very important conversation, which is housing on First Nations communities. I'd first like to thank the Algonquin Anishinaabe for allowing us to gather on this traditional and unceded territory. This report of the Auditor General, I think, underscores the importance of continuing to work with First Nations in addressing the socioeconomic gaps. This issue of housing, as you would know, Mr. Chair, isn't a recent issue. It's the product of decades of underfunding and a colonial system designed to exclude Indigenous peoples from lands and from economy. So therefore, it does take time to rectify and create systemic changes that are needed to ensure that every First Nations person has a safe place to rest their head, that communities have the autonomy they need to proceed in ways that make sense to them, that their houses are able to host children and have families reach their full potential. So as we continue this work together to repair the deep harms of ongoing colonialism and implement the Auditor General's recommendations, I'd like to make that point very clear, that the issues pointed out in the report can only be resolved through the work of true partnership with Indigenous peoples and full self-determination of First Nations, which are things that the federal government for a very long time have worked to actually undermine. And that's why this government has been working hand in hand with First Nations to close the housing gap referenced in the Auditor General's report, which the Assembly of First Nations estimated at $44 billion in 2021. I thank the AFN for their important work in quantifying the gap and providing us a starting point. We've used this gap analysis to inform our path forward, and together with the AFN, the Canada Mortgage and Housing Corporation, and First Nations across Canada, we've co-developed the National First Nations Housing and Related Infrastructure Strategy, which provides us with a path forward to transfer control and management of housing to First Nations. I see the job of the Indigenous Services Minister and the Government of Canada as one to make sure that communities have the support they need to do the work outlined in this strategy. And I can say that last year, Indigenous Services Canada spent a historic amount on infrastructure. In fact, the most the department has ever spent, and we're on track to spend even more. Budget 2024 recently proposed $426 million over 5 years for First Nations housing and related infrastructure on reserve starting this year, on top of the amounts that are already allocated. But the work that we're undertaking is not just about numbers and increased investments. It's about the capacity building to support self-determination and continued work to transfer the care and control of housing to First Nations, because as I've said, they know best how to meet their housing needs. For example, since 2020, Indigenous Services Canada has provided over $3 million to the First Nations Housing Professionals Association. This money is training community members on project management, construction planning, tenant relations, renovation, and repair coordination. And they've certified 48 housing professionals. There are additional 151 people in training, and this will build housing capacity in First Nations communities across the country. Another example, in my own hometown of Thunder Bay, Indigenous Services Canada supports the Indigenous Skilled Trades Training Program in its partnership with Hammersholt High School, where students learn construction skills and build tiny homes, which then get donated to Matawa First Nations. I had an opportunity to visit Hammersholt and meet with some of the students involved in that project. And in fact, one of those students is now on my youth council. It's truly an inspirational project. And this program not only helps students build new skills, but it also connects them to a career in the skilled trades, something that, as many of us know from other committees and work, we desperately need. We're also supporting the transfer of housing and infrastructure services at a pace that is set by First Nations-led organizations. For example, the Confederacy of Mainland Mi'kmaq signed a framework agreement with Indigenous Services Canada in October of 2023 to assume control of design, management, provision, and delivery of their housing and infrastructure programs. So I believe, Mr. Chair, this is the path that we need to maintain, that in the spirit of reconciliation, the time has passed where the Government of Canada tells First Nations what to do, but rather works with First Nations communities to not only build homes, but build that capacity and transfer services so that it helps communities move on to other economic development opportunities that can meet the needs of their growing populations. So thank you for having me today, Mr. Chair, and I'm very happy to take your questions.
Thank you very much, Minister. Begin our first round. The first four members will have 6 minutes each. Mr. Malillo, you have the floor for 6 minutes, please.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and I do want to thank the Minister for being here. I know that, Minister, you've made yourself available for a number of committee discussions in recent weeks at various committees, and I do sincerely appreciate you making that time. I had the opportunity to question you about this report earlier this year. I asked, Minister, if you accepted the report. And your response was that you accept all recommendations, which I do think is a good thing. However, there is a difference between accepting the recommendations and accepting the report in its entirety. Of course, the report highlights that your government has no plan to reach its housing goals, and that the state of housing on First Nations has not improved since 2015. So I'd like to offer you the opportunity to answer again and confirm whether or not you do accept the entirety of this report as an accurate representation of the state of First Nation housing.
We do accept the report, and in fact, although we continue to speak with the Auditor General about, for example, our current allocation methodologies and in exploring changes with communities, we agree that the situation for First Nations in regards to housing needs to change, and so we think that the Auditor General has given us valuable advice, and certainly I'm happy to turn to Mr. Barbosa if you want to add anything about your conversations with the auditor.
Apologies, Mr. Barbosa. I just have limited time. I just want to ask another question because you did answer my question adequately, Minister. You said you agreed or you accepted the recommendations. You agree that things need to change, and unfortunately, it's been your government that has had the power to make that change for the last 9 years. And of course, as the Minister of Indigenous Services, the buck stops with you presently. Earlier this week, I had the opportunity to ask Chief Lance Heyman about what this report means in reality for First Nations that he works with. And he noted that CMHC is going to build 30 units for 43 communities in Quebec this fiscal year. I believe that's less than 3/4 of a unit per community. Would you agree, Minister, that is unacceptable?
Well, I'm glad you mentioned Chief Heyman. It was great to have him at our economic roundtable just the other day, the one that was hosted by the Bank of Canada. In fact, as you know, he is also working with an organization called the Anachia, and our department is working closely with Chief Heyman on how to accelerate that work around home ownership. I will say that I think the context of Mr. Heyman's... I'm sorry, Mr. Chair, do I have the floor?
I just want to clarify.
Mr. Chair, do I have the floor?
Well, Minister, just hold. I've stopped the clock. Minister, there is some give and take here on the floor. This is not like question period where you're assigned the slot. The time belongs to the members. Previously, you heard Mr. Malillo after you answered the question, want to move on, he did that. He is entitled to interrupt if he does so politely, and I would ask that you respect that. The time is the members, not the witnesses. Mr. Malillo, you have the floor.
And thank you, Mr. Chair. And with respect to the minister, I believe I asked a pretty straightforward question about whether or not she believes that 30 units for 43 communities is acceptable or not. And I'd like to give her the opportunity to respond.
I would say CMHC is not the only partner in supporting First Nations housing.
But again, a direct question, do you believe that that is an acceptable level of housing or
I can't
not?
speak to the CMHC manner of apportioning support and funding. That is not the portfolio I hold. But what I can say is that every department that has a responsibility for housing is part of the solution to closing the gap.
Okay, thank you, Minister. I'll move on. The Auditor General also finds in the report that there were not adequate assurances that homes built on First Nation were meeting applicable building code standards in the jurisdiction that First Nation is in. And I think that's a very important aspect of this, because it's one thing to have houses, but they have to be adequate, they have to be safe, and having not a failure to comply with building codes puts First Nation lives at risk. So, Minister, again, do you believe this is acceptable, and why have you allowed this to happen under your watch?
I will say that all federally funded housing on reserve must meet or beat the National Building Code and must demonstrate compliance as a condition for that funding. But I will also say that I am encouraged by your line of questioning that you will support any additional investments and not vote against them again.
And I just want to clarify on that, because, Minister, you just said that all federal funding for housing, it must meet the applicable building codes, but the Auditor General has found that that's not the case. So why isn't that happening?
I will say that, again, federally funded housing must meet or beat the National Building Code. And I would hope that
It's
you
not
understand
happening, though.
that in order to meet National Building Codes, that quality materials must be used, that First Nations must have the supports they need to maintain those buildings, to keep them up to code. And so I would look forward to your vote in favor
And-
of any additional spending in First Nations housing.
I understand all of that, but again, Minister, it's not happening. Why?
I will say again,
Will you
that
commit
funding
to-
that is dedicated to First Nations housing on First Nations must meet or beat. Obviously, as I mentioned, we are working to support First Nations to ensure that housing complies with the code, and I look forward to your support in additional investments that make that possible.
Okay, thank you, Minister. I'd like to ask, obviously we have this report before us on housing highlighting that no progress has been made, that there's no plan to address those housing gaps on First Nation. We know that your government has dragged its feet to address First Nation policing, another very important issue, and the list goes on and on and on. We've seen PBO reports showing that there's been more spending, but not an equal level of ISC's ability to achieve its targets from that spending. Yet with all of this failure, frankly, your department has handed out $3.6 million in bonuses to 94% of ISC's executive staff in the 22-23 fiscal year, and over $4 million to 98% of staff in the following fiscal year. Why are you rewarding staff for this failure?
Well, let me also remind you what the Auditor General noted, that the ongoing and historic lack of investment, in particular the decade before 2015, meant that not only were we not staunching the decline in housing on First Nations, but in fact the gap was growing. And when we were elected, we increased funding by 185% for First Nations housing, 1,100% overall for infrastructure. And that speaks to the lack of attention that the previous Conservative government had for First Nations people. In fact, I encourage you,
You've had 9 years, Minister.
Mr.
9
Malillo.
years.
And that, lady, that is the time. I'm going to turn now to Ms. Shanahan. You have the floor for 6 minutes, please.
Well, thank you very much, Chair, and I thank the Minister for being here with us on this very important topic, because indeed it has been a longstanding problem. We heard testimony the other day, going back to the early 2000s, about the structural problems in addressing housing needs on First Nation reserves and on and off reserves, I would say, and also the chronic lack of funding, which I know that our government has tried to address. it's certainly been, it's not just one size fits all, I would, from what I'm gathering from the testimony that we're hearing. So this is the fourth OAG report on First Nations housing, calling for serious systemic changes to the Government of Canada's supports and programs. And it's clear that our existing systems have led us to this unacceptable housing gap. But we've heard a lot of allegations thrown around in this committee about who's to blame for allowing this to happen. And I'd like to hear your perspective on how we reached this point.
Well, thank you very much, Ms. Shanahan, and thank you for your advocacy. I will say this, the lack of infrastructure in First Nations is a result of a colonial country that has failed to live up to its obligations, treaty and otherwise, to First Nations people in this country. There is a willfulness to doing that, and our government, under the leadership of Prime Minister Justin Trudeau, decided that we would tackle reconciliation in a real and sincere way. In fact, compare that to the previous Prime Minister, Stephen Harper, who said that an inquiry, for example, into missing and murdered Indigenous women was not on their water treatment plants anyway, so they themselves are to blame. These are the kinds of comments that indicate that colonial attitude, that the Government of Canada, that it's wasted money, quite frankly, in First Nations, that they don't deserve it. You'll note that the Conservatives never ask a question in the House of Commons about Indigenous priorities. When was the last time we heard a Conservative get up and ask about why there isn't more housing in First Nations, or how come a particular boil water advisory hasn't been lifted, or why there isn't better supports for First Nations education, which are all reasonable questions. And I want to thank the NDP and the Bloc for asking questions about Indigenous peoples. This is important. It's important because it keeps it on the radar of Canadians. Canadians ultimately elect us. They elect us. And if they don't know what the problem is because their members of parliament are not visiting communities that are within their own ridings, have never met those communities, don't know those people, then it's very hard for them to do their job. But when a prime minister says reconciliation will be at the core of what we do, then the hard work begins. And that's exactly what's happened in this file. Since 2016, we've invested over $10 billion to support Indigenous housing projects. Budget 2024, 25% of the new spend is on Indigenous priorities. That's continued progress. And can we fix a system of colonialism in 9 years? I don't believe we can. But if you speak to many First Nations people, they will say things are better than they were, and we have a long way to go. And I would agree with that.
For that, because I would say, even in my own riding, we border Ganawage, and what was unthinkable, I would say, 10, 20, 30 years ago is happening now, where we have joint partnerships between community organizations in Chateauguay with community organizations in Ganawage for supportive housing, for example, for youth in transition. And this has been a game changer in our relationship. And so I really do believe that we need to start today. Today is the first day of making change. And we did hear some very interesting testimony from Regional Chief Brendan Mitchell, who spoke about the collaboration between the AFN and Indigenous Services Canada in quantifying the housing and infrastructure gap. And I put the emphasis on infrastructure because I think that's where things need to start. But why was it important for the Government of Canada to be part of this report?
Well, thank you very much. And I think it's important because oftentimes First Nations organizations like the AFN may not have the fiscal resources or the technical resources to be able to quantify a gap like that. But in fact, the Government of Canada, despite how difficult it is to hear this for many Canadians, and indeed for governments and for members of Parliament, believes that we can't actually close a gap if we don't know the size of it. And so it is a commitment to First Nations, quite frankly, to support that research, to be able to work with partners, to provide funding to partners, to do Indigenous-led research on, in this case, what the size of the infrastructure gap is, so that not more communities like Chateauguay and Kahnawake can say, this is all of our problem. I'm so glad you brought up your community and the work of reconciliation that happens at the municipal level. I have a similar story with Marathon and Beatagong in Thunder Bay Superior North. two northern communities that have worked together to develop friendships have become regular and routine. I go to wing night at the Legion, and there are many members of Bitagong enjoying wings and beer with other members of Marathon, and they have joined economic activities, and they built a supportive living center together, and they are working together on many exciting endeavors together, but that happens through relationship. And Bitagong and Marathon, I suspect Chateauguay and Kanawaki, are realizing that there's an economic advantage to reconciliation. Listen, it is extremely expensive to keep people in poverty. But when we start to realize that we're each other's people and we come together in ways that at all levels of government, like you've just pointed out, there is such an opportunity, not just in terms of better relationships and better outcomes for Indigenous people and but for the economy of Canada to do better.
Thank you, Minister. That is the time. Suivant, c'est Madame Saint-Claude Desgagnés pour 6 minutes, s'il vous plaît.
Hello, Madam Minister. Thank you for appearing before the committee once again. So we know that, and we're not going to go into the detail, we've already heard the figures before the committee, but the report of the Auditor General is quite alarming on the state of construction for new housing. We agree because you've accepted the report and the recommendations. When we think that in terms of proportion, that very few increases of new housing starts with regards to what's necessary, and very few housing units were repaired, is quite alarming. So I would like to congratulate you that in your introductory speech you did mention that finally, after 150 years or more of Confederation, to reach the conclusion that the federal government should withdraw from Indigenous issues. And I think that's actually a good thing. But one of the major challenges to overcome, and when we speak of Indigenous housing development and the development of First Nations, is found in the certain elements of the Indian Act. So it's not just you, but you and also Northern Affairs, but yourself as a minister, what are you doing if you understand that you do need to withdraw from assistance and allow Indigenous peoples to manage themselves? What are you doing to at least reduce the amount of obstacles in their way?
La question.
Thank you for the question.
Let's be clear. I think there is always going to be a role for the federal government to honor the treaties, and I'm not sure if it's the translation, but withdraw may not be the exact translation that you mean.
On va pas commencer à critiquer le travail des interprètes.
So we're not going to start criticizing the interpreters, but
Criticizing the interpreter. I'm just saying the word withdraw, I assume that's what you mean. And what I would say is that there isn't a withdrawal from treaty. Treaties are actually agreements that are signed till the sun shines and, forever.
Excusez-moi, Madame la Ministre, je pose une...
Sorry, I asked a very specific question on elements that are roadblocks.
La loi sur les Indiens.
And I'm telling you that there isn't a concept
Point of order,
that
Chair.
could withdraw from treaty.
Point of order.
Just one, yes, Mr. Brock.
The minister knows full well.
Okay, Mr. Brock.
No, I'm
this
talking
is-
about talking over each other.
Mr. Brock, this is not your time. Madame Saint-Claude is able to defend her round. You will have an opportunity to ask questions of the minister, but it is not now. Madame Saint-Claude Desgagnés, vous avez 3 minutes.
You have 3 minutes and 30. You have 3 minutes and 30 seconds left. Yes, I'd like to remind you that we're not here to criticize the interpreters, but to answer questions, please. So, Madam Minister, here's a second, for a second and a third time, the Indian Act. Some elements, I hate the name, but some elements in this act are hindering economic development, construction of new housing, trying to obtain funds from a bank. And so there are roadblocks in the way. What is your government doing, at least to stop hindering?
So that's a very... That is exactly the approach that our government has taken. In fact, the Indian Act, although it is hated by many, many First Nations people, and of course many people would like to see the elimination of the Indian Act, there are other First Nations people who feel that until those protections, and there are some within the Indian Act, are established in other pieces of law, that act needs to remain and be dismantled piece by piece. And so depending on who you speak to, you will hear different perspectives. That is why we've approached inherent rights through other legislation, like the child welfare legislation, that I will point out the government of Quebec fought at the Supreme Court and in fact lost. The federal government supported that legislation all the way through that Supreme Court process, which established an inherent right. Well, I shouldn't say it established. It restored the inherent right, actually, of First Nations people to raise their children and families.
D'accord.
So that
Merci.
is how we are approaching eliminating the Indian
J'ai
Act.
précisé un élément important qui est, par exemple,
I spoke to an important element that a bank can seize a property. So this is a roadblock. It's an issue now with commercial banks. We know it. It's an issue. It's a problem. If someone from a reserve is trying to get a loan, there are programs. You did speak to the programs, and I'm pleased at the Bloc Québécois we're pushing for these types of programs. So I'm very happy. But are you going to follow the example of Yanashia and reduce obstacles in the way that are created by the federal government for these First Nations?
Answer is yes, and that's the point behind things like the Economic Roundtable that we had just a week ago or two, hosted by the Bank of Canada with attendance by all of the major banks, the First Nations Bank of Canada, the Infrastructure Bank, to talk about the barriers to accessing capital, including for housing, posed by various pieces of legislation, but also by internal bank processes themselves. And the enthusiasm in that meeting was, if I could have tapped
Super.
that enthusiasm, I would have brought it with me
merci,
everywhere.
Madame.
That's great. Thank you, Madam Minister. This week, we saw the former clerk of the Privy Council and former Deputy Minister of Indigenous Affairs to say that he didn't really believe that we needed to take away the responsibility to fund or to build, and that this should be given to a whole new Crown Corp. What do you think about that?
Yeah, having not heard his comments, I don't want to speak directly to his comments. I'll answer what I think you're saying. But I would say that the work that we're doing right now on infrastructure reform is the appropriate way. That what the government should be doing is being a good treaty partner and other partner and with other agreements to provide financial support, technical support, and capacity building support so that First Nations have control over their own infrastructure.
Allez-vous préciser?
Are you going to reform some parts of the Indian Act, such as those that I mentioned, very specifically? For example, also I spoke to insurance, and I spoke to the title of the Act. Can you confirm that during this legislature we'll see huge changes to the Act?
Well, I think you can rest assured that we will be working in all of the ways that we can to support the self-determination of people, First Nations people, at the speed and in the ways that they want. It's why the legislation on First Nations clean drinking water is so important, in fact, because that's part of that work, to support First Nations with adequacy of funding that's co-developed and that provides a framework to better have control over the water that serves their systems.
Et voilà, merci beaucoup. Suivant.
Thank you very much.
Minutes, please.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. I want to thank the Minister for being present with us today. I'll take a different approach than I think often is taken in these kind of committee meetings to try to paint a picture, I think, of what has been largely the story or more modern narrative of our country. Are you familiar with the traditional stories of many nations, including the area I come from, of shapeshifters?
I am, actually, yes.
And shapeshifters, you may know, their nature is the same, but how they appear is different. The things they do is different. How they operate is different. But the nature of that being is the same, sometimes for malice and sometimes for benevolence. But the issue with the shapeshifting is it seeks to deceive. It seeks to use the better will of those who would see others and the goodwill that they could offer as a benefit to manipulate. Canada and our country has largely been a shapeshifter in its approach to Indigenous people. As a colonial state in the 1867, its establishment, it sought to bind Canada together with two bands of steel and largely with the force of the Northwest Mounted Police, bringing many Indigenous nations to their knees in using this objective force to force the creation of reserve systems, to forcefully reserve Indigenous people. It then would shapeshift into a settler colonial state that we notice in our parents' and grandparents' generation, this attempt to take away the rights of Indigenous people in the pursuit of a more noble idea that they thought they were doing something right, this idea of equalization. What if we just enfranchise everyone? They will be equalized. And we've seen that the paramount of that work manifested in the former Prime Minister Trudeau's white paper. It was, of course, rejected by Indigenous people from Alberta in particular. Harold Cardinal brought forward the red paper, which rejected this approach, this assimilation approach to what the government's intent was, even though at one side they told Canadians what they were doing was good. Just like Sir John A. Macdonald said to Canadians when he built residential schools. This is for the goodness of Indigenous people. I find it very difficult to believe that the state today has changed in its objectives towards Indigenous people. It's evidenced by these audits, and there will be no answers that you can give us today to build credibility towards that fact. But I hope to, at least today in my time, in our discussion today, to at least have you realize and reflect the very deeply disturbing nature of the mandate of your ministry and Crown Indigenous Relations and the overall principle from the Prime Minister's office of how they're undertaking reconciliation. The ideology that's being undertaken sounds great, just like Sir John A. mentioned, the residential schools would be great. Just like we've seen Pierre Elliott Trudeau say the destruction and elimination of Indigenous rights was going to be great. We see today the attempt of this government to use the very legitimate claims of Indigenous self-determination, the very real exclamation of their rights to their own lands, to their own people, to their own future, as an excuse in the delay that is being experienced when it comes to material enhancements in community. You said it in your speech that the number one process that will solve this problem takes partnership, and true partnership takes time. Unfortunately, there are people who suffer in the time that is undertaken. And could you comment on who suffers the most when time is often given to the benefit of the government? Who suffers the most?
Well, I think we know who suffers the most, and I think it's represented in the kinds of historic compensation that we've seen under our government. The $20 billion in child welfare legislation, or child welfare compensation, the $8 billion in lack of access to clean water. But the difference is this government is no longer hiding from not only the legacy of the colonialism of this country, but trying to form those better relationships. And please be assured that I believe, and as I was responding to MP Shanahan, that the time, you're right, people suffer, children suffer, families suffer, but I think the time is changing. And I think MP Shanahan's example is a good one of the kinds of efforts that can be put forward at all levels of government, including ours, which has to show that leadership and that equity.
No, I appreciate that response, and it highlights my next point, which is second to the new kind of colonialism that the state is undertaking today. This reconciliation first model that on the front of it, especially if you go to the West Coast, and I'm sure you have, their tradition of the transformation mask, where you see a beautiful mask and it means, it's welcoming in some ways. But then when the mask opens and the raven's mouth is bare, you see what it truly is. And it's a shockingly disturbing sight. It's a site that would use, for example, compensation tools that were largely met because First Nations had to force the government to court in order to get that compensation is truly disturbing. And the fact that many of the agreements, nearly all of the modern agreements your government has signed are largely liability agreements. They seek to devolve the liability of the federal government to housing, to water, to jurisdiction of families, to Indigenous people. And you mentioned the care and control. That's the part where the care and control piece is very difficult, because in the court of law, where the government loses 99% of its court cases on liability issues, we see the government respond to those liability issues by presenting agreements that on the face of it look really good. But deep down within them, if you read those agreements, it's a transfer of liability, care, and control. So when you see care and control, you also mean liability, correct?
Question, Mr. Desjardins. Your time is up, so if you have a
I
question.
guess
That was the question.
Okay,
Mr.
thank you.
Desjardins,
Minister, you have the floor.
Do I have the...
Yes, you do. You have the floor for an
Thank
answer.
you,
Yes, pardon
Mr.
me.
Chair. There's a lot packed into your statement, and look at overall, I can understand why First Nations people are on a continuum of trust with this federal government, or any government, or really any space in this country. I mean, let's talk about, just briefly, racism in healthcare. Many First Nations people don't trust healthcare systems that were intended to be for all, but in fact, Indigenous people have been excluded from for decades and since their institution. But I will just say that we have over 150 10-year agreements that were carefully created by those First Nations and signed on behalf of the government and those First Nations. And we regularly support those First Nations in the delivery of services. And I would ask that if you have particular First Nations that are not happy with their 10-year agreements, that they would reach out to my office.
It'll be a yes or no.
Sure.
Thank you. The question is largely in regards to the government's attempt to devolve or seek care and control devolution, it's often been known as. Does that include the liability for those services?
I'm going to turn to Nelson just to speak about some of the mechanics of the 10-year agreements.
Thank you for
Just
the
the liability, please. Who is liable now that these agreements are signed for the failure to deliver service?
So there, as we've mentioned in this committee before, on the pathway to transfer, there's been a transfer agreement signed, and that's the Atlantic First Nations Water Authority, which we spoke to. The organization, the Atlantic First Nation Water Authority, administers water services for its member communities, including the regulatory services and the administration.
Sorry, you're not
of
answering the
water.
question. Who's now liable?
Mr. Dijla, I will have to come back to you. You will
I
have
feel it's a
another.
yes or no
another
question, Chair.
We're
Why are they avoiding
well
it?
over the time, and you will certainly have an opportunity to come back again. Mr. Brock, you have the floor for 5 minutes, please.
Thank you, Chair. Minister Haidu, I proudly represent the riding of Brantford-Brant. I also represent the First Nations community of Six Nations of the Grand River. And I'm sure the minister remembers I have written to you on numerous occasions regarding the federal funding needed for the Gayaweni Immersion School on Six Nations of the Grand River Territory. Despite my previous correspondence and numerous follow-ups over the past 3 years, my office has not received any updates regarding the status of this necessary funding. The initial request for funding was literally 8.5 years ago. This delay has led to a significant increase in project costs, creating challenges for the school's operations. Last month at this very committee, I raised the issue, and a member of your ministry indicated that they would follow up. So can you tell us today when we can expect to receive the urgently needed funding?
Well, thank you very much for the question. And I do have a letter here dated March 30th that I sent to you, Mr. Brock, March 30th, 2023. So I assume that you have that in your possession as well. So in terms of not responding, I do want to put it on the record that, in fact, I did. But I will say that Indigenous Services Canada has supported the design brief for the school, and we're continuing to engage with the school across government departments.
When was the last time you engaged?
I believe I was in Six Nations last year, but we can check the exact date.
I'd like to get the exact date.
I will get you the exact date. I
Okay,
visited
you
not only
indicated
Six
you
Nations
corresponded
with,
to me
the
in
former
March.
Chief, but Chief
I have the
Hill.
floor. You indicated to me you responded, and I know you dislike that, but this is members' time, not minister's time.
Mr. Brock, the witness is minister's aware of the rules. This is your time. We've gone over
I don't
this
think she
before.
does, Chair, but thank you.
Mr. Brock, you've got 3 minutes.
Thank you. So you responded over almost 1.5 years ago. In that particular letter, I'm sure you spelt out no specific timeline as to when this school is going to get the necessary funding. How long do the children of my community, the children of the Six Nations community, have to suffer with inadequate funding? Why can't you write a check and find the necessary funding, as we've been pressing your ministry for the better part of the entire tenure of your government? What do you say to the people of the Six Nations?
Well, first I say thank you for the visit and for the opportunity to work on the many issues that Six Nations continues to drive forward, including, I think, their incredible economic development success. And I will say that we'll continue to work with them on the successful
Which is a
funding of the school.
non-answer. Thank you so much. The AG's report underscores the long-standing health hazard posed by mold in First Nation communities. And she concludes that ISC appears to struggle in fully understanding the severity of the issue. I want to illustrate a case again from my riding. The Gagnos Medical Center of the Six Nations of the Grand is the sole medical center with federal employees providing vital dental and sexual health services. Was compelled to close due to mold infestation. They reached out to you personally. You refused to meet with them. This scenario should highlight the urgency of the situation. When will your ministry earnestly address these matters, prioritize funding for this crucial medical center, and provide a meaningful response to the Six Nations community?
Well, thank you for your question, and I assume by the line of your questioning that when Indigenous items come up for voting in allocations of funds and in budgeting, that you will vote in favor, and I'll watch for your vote. Because, in fact, as you know, we have a very significant infrastructure gap, and any appropriation of money from the federal treasury that goes towards Indigenous spending is critically important to actually complete these kinds of projects.
When will you
I appreciate the question.
When will you fund the mold removal so that the 25,000 residents of Six Nations do not have adequate medical services? That is an absolute disgrace, and it's on your shoulders, Minister. When are you going to clean up the mold?
Well, I really look forward to the letter that you'll write in support of my next budget ask that will ensure that Indigenous Services Canada has a significant investment in closing infrastructure gaps so that we more quickly can build the infrastructure across the country that I hear you agreeing we need to do quickly.
Thank you. That is the time, I'm afraid. Ms. Yip, you have the floor for 5 minutes, please.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you, Minister Hajdu, for coming to another committee to speak again on this important issue of housing in the First Nations communities. I'd like to go back to talking about housing and the infrastructure gap. Why do you think it took so long to figure out the true costs of the housing and infrastructure gap?
Well, thank you very much, MP Yip, and thank you for your advocacy in this area. And I would say that I don't think previous governments wanted to know the size of the infrastructure gap, in particular the previous Conservative government, who, as you know, didn't invest in any significant way in the needs of Indigenous communities, First Nations communities in particular, but certainly in Inuit communities and Métis communities. And so this is the important work that has to be done, and it's an uncomfortable truth. I think that's why governments don't want to quantify things like this, because when we know that the infrastructure gap, currently estimated at $360 billion, is that size, it means that governments must act, and they must act creatively, and they must encourage partners to think about ways that we close that gap together differently. It puts and centers the needs of Indigenous communities in our conversations, at least for some of us, and certainly I think that's part of the reason the gap has never been quantified before.
Has the government's approach changed to closing the gap since we were able to put a dollar figure on it?
Well, I think you saw ambition in this year's budget, in Budget 2024, where fully almost 25%, 24% of new spending is on Indigenous priorities. And it's a commitment, an ongoing commitment of the federal government under the Liberals to keep reconciliation centered in the work we do. It isn't an easy journey. It isn't a short journey. But as I say often in speeches I give in places with partners and in First Nations, that the flame of reconciliation is lit. It's like every other tiny flame. It needs constant nourishing and protection from anything that might put it out.
Just the other day, we heard some excellent testimony from Chief Lance Heyman about his work to build homes on reserve finance through private capital. I found that very interesting. And are you looking at options like Chief Hammond's to help close the housing gap?
Right person, I'm sorry. Yes, we are. The short answer is yes, we are. We are looking for anything that can leverage the investments of the federal government in the work of closing the infrastructure gap, including innovation and financing that is Indigenous-led, including in supporting deeper connections between the private sector, who often has capital to invest, but many barriers to investing that capital in First Nations endeavors. I would also note that Chief Heyman was here when we tabled the water legislation, Bill C-61, and he was an active participant in the co-creation of that legislation, as well as many other First Nations across the country. And I think that he is a significant leader to watch in terms of the kinds of creativity that we need across this country to deal with such a gap.
Yes, he did mention looking at both Indigenous-led and others in the financial sector. Are you talking to anyone in the financial sector?
Absolutely, I certainly am. In fact, as I mentioned, we had the second economic roundtable just a couple of weeks ago. The first we hosted, the Indigenous Services Canada team, and did a fantastic job. We had representation from all of the major banks and all across the financial sector. There was such enthusiasm that the Bank of Canada offered to host the second one. That gave me a lot of excitement because, of course, they were able to ensure that there were a variety of different partners at the table, including all of the major banks, the Canada Infrastructure Bank, the First Nations Bank of Canada, and many others. And so there is an enthusiasm, I will tell you, in corporate Canada to really challenge ourselves on the kinds of barriers to accessing capital that First Nations communities and First Nations businesses are facing. And I look forward to the next steps in this work.
Why do you think some of these initiatives have taken so long to gain momentum? I'm really glad to hear that some of these major banks are stepping up or at least interested, but it seems like it's been a long time. Why?
Well, I would say that some banks and some institutions actually have come a long way, and they have a variety of different professionals and departments within their bank that's very focused on economic reconciliation and capital access to First Nations and supporting Indigenous businesses. Others do not have that same expertise. And I would say that, look, the history of Canada has been economic exclusion of First Nations people. This is a hard pattern to break. But the good news is, as I sense that from capital markets, from corporate Canada, that there is a growing recognition of the economic advantage of reconciliation. This isn't just the right thing to do. This is the smart thing to do.
Thank you, Minister. Encore une fois, Madame Cycle Desgagnés pour 2 minutes 30 secondes, s'il vous plaît.
Merci, Monsieur.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I have a specific question for you, Madam Minister. What do you have to say about the recommendation that we heard earlier this week, saying that the Parliament should adopt a bill that between now and 10 years we should abolish the Indian Act? What's your opinion on this?
I would say that I would like to hear from First Nations in a larger way, because not everybody has the same perspective on how to do that and how to do that in a way that protects the rights that are enshrined within the Indian Act, as repulsive as that act is to many people. What I have also heard from some First Nations leaders is that it also has protections that need to be enshrined in other ways.
Parfait.
Great. And so do you have a timeline? Do you have a timeline as to when you could do a total and complete review of the Indian Act? Do you have an end date? Could we share this with the committee on the reforms that you might want to implement?
What First Nations leaders tell me is that the way that we are going about this by creating specific legislation, like the child welfare legislation that restores inherent rights of Indigenous people to care for their own children and families, is the right way to do this. It allows for a controlled dismantling of the Indian Act that puts control back in First Nations in a timeline that makes sense to them. It provides certainty around funding models, and it provides the supports that First Nations say they need in order to do a thorough consultation and design of those systems for their communities.
Avez-vous remarqué que ce soit à travers...
Have you noticed that through the Auditor General's report or through the testimony provided by Mr. Amond, that oftentimes the most wonderful initiatives between First Nations and new Canadians, if we can call them that, the French or the English, regardless, that the best examples are oftentimes in Quebec, and whether it be La Paix des Braves or others, the Quebec people have. Don't you think that we could have a nation-to-nation approach such as that we've had in Quebec?
I think that is exactly the approach we're taking, is a nation-to-nation relationship with First Nations people. I would also say that there is fantastic work happening on creating tools that First Nations people are saying they need to fully capitalize from the economy of Canada. I'll point to the $5 billion loan guarantee that was announced in Budget 2024, roundly applauded by First Nations leaders, First Nations business, who say now they will have the economic tool, the capital tool that they need to be able to fully participate in major infrastructure and major energy projects across this country.
Et voilà, merci beaucoup. Suivant is Mr. Desjardins. You have the floor for 2.5 minutes, please.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. We spoke to one of the country's most modern Indian agents probably ever in our history, Michael Wernick, just the other day. And his testimony was extreme in his approach, not just to his time at Privy Council and his advice to Cabinet and his advice to the Prime Minister's office on this tremendous need to move past the Indian Act. And he even recommended that it should be abolished within 10 years. And then he even criticized that now, the sitting government, as not having the will to do what he has recommended. He's the same gentleman that largely has been the deputy minister for the years that these audits have been present to them. From 2003 to today, under his watch, he then recommended this insidious approach that has largely made up the mandate of the reconciliation process that's undertaken by the government today. This issue he presented that the courts were being utilized by Indigenous people who are seeking justice, rightfully by Indigenous people, but the government was losing billions of dollars and finding itself in a position where its liability was being challenged, and there needed to be a risk management approach to this liability. A very disgusting way to speak about human rights breaches in our country, to measure things down to who is liable and how does the government risk assess its liability out of this. These are real conversations that I know are present in your ministry and also ministries between you and the Ministry of Justice. You often get briefing notes from the Ministry of Justice and memorandums that seek to limit the risk that is present between government agreements that you sign on behalf of the Crown with Indigenous people. So I'll ask again, who is liable when care and control is transferred to an Indigenous government?
I think I'll answer broadly, but I would say that no agreement is signed without full participation of the partner organization or First Nation. But I'll turn to Mr. Barbosa.
Thanks for the follow-up question.
Limited time, so if you can please just answer the question.
The first point is, who is the agreement with? So the transfer of care and control is not a de-evolution or a transfer of responsibility from the Government of Canada to a First Nation. What's happening in Atlantic Canada, across the country, is the establishment of organizations like the Assembly of First Nations who work with First Nations to support the administration.
If a government, an Indigenous government, is to litigate like they have in the past under these new agreements, who is liable?
So the litigation prerogative still remains with First Nations. The relationship with Canada shifts to the organization that First Nations decide to stand up. And those organizations, like in the Atlantic context, manage
In other
water.
means the responsibility and liability shifts
The water
to the organization from the Government of Canada.
No, it's about the relationship. The relationship changes from the First Nation to the organization that the First Nation determines they want to run their systems.
And that is the time, I'm afraid. That is the time. Turning now to Mr. Nader. You have the floor for 5 minutes, please.
Thank you, Chair, and through you, thank you to our witnesses for joining us. In a previous line of questioning, Mr. Brock brought up a very local example from his area about mold, and we've heard this through the Auditor General report. And one thing that the Auditor General noted very strongly is that there was no indication of when or why or for what reasons the 2008 mold strategy ceased to operate? We've asked this question to your deputy minister. We have asked this question to the former clerk of the Privy Council, to the former deputy minister at the department, but we have yet to receive a clear answer. So you've now had several weeks since this report has tabled. Can you tell us why the mold strategy is no longer being used?
Answer that. I don't know the answer.
So just, if I may, Mr. Chair, a number of years ago, there was a specific mold strategy. At a certain point of time, we decided with the participation of First Nations to make that particular funding stream as flexible as possible, including if they wanted to invest in mold, if they wanted to invest in housing, if they wanted to invest in lot remediation or what have you. It was in the purview, and it is in the purview of First Nations to decide.
So really not really answered on when that actually stopped being used. When was it stopped?
Finished over a number of years, so there's no precise time where.
And I
where
think
it
the
stopped.
point that the deputy is making is that in true spirit of self-determination, prescriptive programs that define for First Nations what exactly this particular line of money must be used for, First Nations have often said is not helpful because, as you know, mold remediation has a number of different steps along the way, including the protection of homes from the ongoing onslaught of water, which, by the way, is an increasing challenge related as it relates to climate change.
In the Auditor General's report, and I'm going to quote here, she wrote, "Overall, we found that among communities of similar sizes, communities with the poorest housing conditions received less targeted funding than those with better housing." So when we talk about the situation that we find ourselves here today, why is it those in the most need are actually the ones receiving the least amount of funding?
I'll turn to Mr. Barbosa to answer that question.
No, Minister, I would like you to answer this question. This is your department. You are accountable as the minister. Why is it those in the most need are receiving the least amount of funding?
So you get to ask the question, and I get to answer it. And I'm going to turn to Mr. Barbosa for the answer.
Thank you for the question. Very briefly, I would say we recognize the housing gap is large. I would say we assessed the same level of data that the Auditor General did, and we looked at communities with the poorest housing conditions and how we allocate money. And we found that from 2018 to 2023, First Nations with the highest need received approximately 39% more funding per capita than communities with other housing and higher housing conditions. We also looked at the metrics that were proposed by the Auditor General, looking at communities with housing with 100 or fewer housing units. And we found roughly on average that those communities received roughly 50% more funding than communities on the other end of the spectrum. So we don't disagree that the housing need is great. What we take a little bit of concern with was how the metric was portrayed in the report.
And I'm sure First Nations communities appreciate you quibbling with metrics when there are folks in this country who are not having adequate housing. I'm sure they appreciate you quibbling with metrics. But I want to follow up. Chief Lance Hayman said this: the bigger challenge that most of these initiatives are proposal driven. So those with the greatest needs have the least capacity. So lesser capacity First Nations are getting less of the national budget. Would you agree with what Chief Hayman said here earlier this week?
I would say in part for certain infrastructures, proposal-based infrastructure funding can be very challenging for communities. But I would also say that there are communities where multi-year funding is in place, and that does provide the flexibility that Chief Hayman has noted is important. I will also, MP Nader, encourage you to vote for any measures that increase spending for Indigenous priorities, and I will note that you voted against them all.
I would also note, Minister, that you have failed to address the actual concerns of folks on the ground in these communities. Do I have enough time for a quick question? In response to Mr. Melillo's question, you said that all requirements, funding requirements, were to comply with the building code. But what the Auditor General found was that the department did not have documentation certifying that the projects actually met the building codes. How is it this lack of documentation exists within your department?
Well, The department works very closely with First Nations, as you know, in a true nation-to-nation relationship. And we work with First Nations to ensure that the approach does not follow the colonial history that I would say the former Conservatives were very fond of, and perhaps, judging by the line of questions today, would be fond of again, whereby communities are penalized harshly for any perceived infraction of any code. And so we work with First Nations to support the maintenance of buildings, to ensure that new builds are compliant with code, and we'll continue to do that.
Thank you. That's the time. Ms. Bradford, you have the final 5 minutes, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to the witnesses for joining us today. Indigenous communities are at the forefront of our fight against climate change. Obviously, it's hard to make long-term plans when your community is forced to evacuate or rebuild every year because of a wildfire or flooding. How big of an impact is climate change having on construction timelines and costs? And what are you hearing from the First Nation partners?
Oh, wow. That's actually an emotional question for me, because I've visited with so many communities that have been devastated by either floods or wildfires. In fact, just a few months ago, I was in Squalex and Lytton First Nation on the West Coast, who experienced a devastating wildfire in 2021, I believe it was. And now here we are in 2024, and the new houses are just arriving. In fact, after a devastating event like that, there is site remediation. There are oftentimes evacuations in a crisis mode, and then long-term evacuations. Those First Nations have worked incredibly hard to support members to come back to their communities, often in temporary housing. One community, Lytton First Nation, had temporary mobile units for families, so they didn't have to stay so far away from their community for so long as the housing was getting rebuilt. In fact, oftentimes, and I think this is I found this very striking. You know, one of the buildings that burnt down was an administration building where, in fact, many members had said that there were remains of First Nations people from time immemorial. Of course, the then colonial government did not listen or believe that story of the members. And in fact, in the remediation process through archaeological examination, in fact, there were a significant number of remains of former members. That takes time to do the archaeological underpinning for any of that kind of work. In Squalex, it was truly incredible to see just how fast things are moving, with some internal capacity to do all of the civil engineering that is required to work with people like BC Hydro and the many other service providers to hook up electricity. I could go on. MP Bradford, the last thing I'll say is that climate change is presenting an ongoing and escalating risk to First Nations communities who are often on the front line of these crises. During wildfire season, my department has a specially trained team of people who can very quickly pivot to emergency management supports. First Nations themselves have emergency management coordinators. We've funded increased capacity, but increasingly, we're seeing the devastation of climate change wreak havoc on Indigenous communities.
So along that line, is there any thought of permanently relocating some of these communities to safer areas not so prone to natural disasters, such as flooding or fire, so they don't have to go through this constant turmoil year after year?
Well, I mean, to answer that question, first I have to say that First Nations people were put there
I know.
intentionally out of way from colonial cities and towns, dispossessed from the land that they had inhabited for a very long time. And so the process of moving community is very emotional. If a community is interested, for example, in the potential of exploring that, of course, the Government of Canada, under our leadership, would be supportive of that. And there are communities that have a routine and ongoing flooding. The challenge is where, to be honest, and the challenge is also connection to that land, connection to that. I just told you the story of remains in the community where these are remains that could be centuries old. So it's not as easy. I would ask you the same, I suppose, if Bradford, I'm sorry, I forgot your community.
Well, actually, the one I'm living in now is Kitchener.
Okay, so if Kitchener all of a sudden was uninhabitable, it would be a very emotional thing to
Oh, I
contemplate
understand.
leaving.
I just wonder.
And so what I would say is it's really important that we do everything in partnership with First Nations. So
Exactly.
when a First Nation is interested in contemplating something like a relocation, of course, the government of Canada, I believe, has an obligation to entertain the support of that. But I can tell you those are deeply, deeply emotional conversations and thoughts.
Right. So returning to the
Have to be a brief question. Ms. Bradford.
about the importance of self-determination and a nation-led approach, would again, could apply to this too. Where do you see the balance between transferring control to First Nations and ensuring that the government is doing its job by proactively supporting the communities, equipping them with the tools they need for success, and making sure that they're not left on their own or set up to fail? I mean, we look at this with water management and all these different things. So
Well, I think I'm glad that you spoke about water, because I will say I just got a letter today from the Blackfoot Confederacy talking about their support for the Bill C-61 legislation that we've just tabled and that will be arriving at INAN committee. And I'd just like to read you in a statement. They say no consultation process will ever be perfect. However, starting over 2 years ago, all First Nations were offered a significant opportunity by Canada to be directly involved in the development of Bill C-61. Our nations provided extensive legal and historical submissions about our treaty water rights at the outset of the consultation process. We met many times with Canada's Bill C-61 team to review and comment on drafts of the legislation, and by the time Bill C-61 was introduced in Parliament, we were able to get significant changes made, including broadening the recognition of our inherent right of self-government to include all aspects of water in general, not just drinking water. We also secured the protection in S-15 of the rights of First Nations to sufficient supplies of water, which is critically important in many regions where water scarcity is an issue. Our general point is that all First Nations had the same opportunity to consult with Canada about Bill C-61 over a period of more than 2 years. These consultations were meaningful in our experience and resulted in real and significant improvements to Bill C-61. So to me, that is the approach that I think we need to continue to take. It's truly partnership. It's challenging our systems and institutions to share power, to listen to First Nations about what they want to see in the governance of not just their community, but this country. They are valuable partners.
Thank you very much. I'm afraid that is the time, and we're well over. Ms. Wilson, would you be able to provide to the committee in writing, I'd like some more details around the why the mold strategy is not being used anymore. I'm struggling to understand what you said with kind of the Treasury Board requirements in terms of spending envelopes and then delivery. I don't want to ask for an answer now, but if you could get back to the committee, please, with an explanation on that how that program was phased out with a little more specifics and timeline, the committee would appreciate it.
Happy to send the committee a brief.
Thank you. Mr. Desjardins, I'm going to need unanimous consent for you to ask a question. We are. Oh yeah, okay.
It's actually in addition to your request for documents.
Yes.
If we can also include in the request for that update in writing a request for an update in the department's response to the Auditor General's point made in 2.34 related to the Canada Mortgage and Housing Corporation, that the Auditor General found that the ministry in cooperation with CMHC underfunded the Alberta, Saskatchewan, Manitoba region by using outdated and old formulas.
Would that be possible, Ms. Wilson?
I can't promise for CMHC.
Oh.
In terms of the department's response.
If the question is about what data we use in terms of appropriating funds, we use current census data.
Yes.
You use current census data in this regard?
Yes.
Okay, sure. That would be good if you can supply that.
We
But I understand that this portion of the agreement speaks directly to CMHC in cooperation with ISC.
I don't believe so. I believe
There's
it's
no
about how
cooperation in this regard?
each department appropriates their funds, and for ISC, we appropriate against current census data 2021.
And so this is not, you're saying this is not your problem?
I'm saying there's two parties to ask that question to.
And you have no responsibility for it?
I have a responsibility for ISC funding, which we use 2021.
All right.
So in this regard, none?
All right. could you do your best if there's an aspect that you're responsible for? If you
Just
could,
do something about it. My God.
if you
We'd be
could
happy to
respond.
provide a funding history of how we appropriate funds. to
Can you
Alberta.
talk to CMHC at least?
All right, Mr. Deja, we'll get a response, and then we'll take next steps. I would thank the minister, but she's already left. That's very, very unusual. Order, Mr. Desjardins. I would thank the minister.
What kinds of answers, Chair?
Sorry. Let's get the answer back, and then this committee can take steps if you're not satisfied with it. But
I'm not satisfied. They're not doing it.
We're well over.
It's someone's problem.
Mr. Desjardins, I'm granting you extra time. I allowed it back and forth.
And I
There's
appreciate that, Chair.
resistance.
It's not against you.
We're going to get an answer. We will see what they respond, and then this committee can take it up again. Again, you have my commitment on that we will look at it and act if necessary.
Thank you, Chair.
Very good. Again, the minister's left already. Very, very unusual. So I'll thank the officials. I'm sorry the minister is so busy. She had to rush out before we conclude our business. I will suspend this meeting, and we'll call on the next minister within a minute. The committee, the minister, and other witnesses could take their seats, please. I'm going to welcome everyone back. And to switch gears, conformément à l'article 108.3G.
In accordance with Standing Order 1083G, the committee resumes consideration of Report 1, ArriveCan, referred to the committee on Monday, February 12, 2024.
Witness, the Honorable Bill Blair, PC, MP, Minister of National Defense. Thank you for coming in today. We appreciate it. And your officials from the Department of National Defense. We have Stephanie Beck, Deputy Minister. Ms. Beck, is this your first committee appearance as a Deputy Minister?
Not as Deputy Minister, but as Deputy Minister of National Defense. It's day 4.
Very good. Well, welcome. This will be a good run through because I'm sure you'll be at National Defense soon enough. So very good, and congratulations on the appointment. Troy Crosby, Assistant Deputy Minister, Materials Group, and Isabelle Desmarty, Assistant Deputy Minister, Human Resources Civilian. Mr. Blair, you have 5 minutes opening statement.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and thank you for the kind invitation to come and appear before this committee. As you've already noted, I am joined by our new Deputy Minister of National Defense, who was previously a Deputy Minister at Agriculture, but Ms. Stephanie Beck and the others, and I won't repeat them because you've done so. First of all, if I may, I'd like to be clear with members of this committee that while I have the benefit of excellent and regular briefings from these senior officials with me today, I have had no direct involvement in the matters that this committee is studying. Hiring decisions and the administration of the public service is rightly the responsibility of the Deputy Minister. Ministerial intervention in this area is both inappropriate and wrong. However, each of us takes the issue of transparency and ethical conduct in government contracting very seriously, as does every single person at the Department of National Defense. We know that every dollar counts, especially when it comes to protecting Canada and Canadians, and that Canadians expect all of us to use their hard-earned money wisely. I'd like to spend the next few minutes highlighting the rules, expectations, and processes that are in place to ensure that we're meeting the highest standards possible when we contract outside the department. The defense team is made up of a dedicated group of people who are responsible for protecting Canada and Canadians, as well as advancing Canadian interests around the world. To support their critical work, our department will sometimes seek third-party expertise from outside contracting firms. And in these types of contracts, and indeed in all procurements, the department must follow Canadian laws and policies to the letter. Procurements must be conducted in a fair, open, and transparent manner in accordance with Treasury Board policies, as well as regulations, guidelines, trade agreements, and procedures. We recognize the importance of the competitive contracting process. 95% of all contracts awarded by the department over the past 3 years were awarded competitively. However, in some limited cases, including for some lower value contracts, the department will occasionally procure goods and services through a non-competitive process in order to deliver results quickly. In all cases, we ensure contracts are awarded transparently and achieve expected results, delivering value for money. We also have defense ethics training available to all employees at the Department of National Defense, and as with all departments, we are obligated to publicly disclose all contracts over $10,000 on the Open Government portal. Likewise, we expect all defense team members and all third-party organizations to follow the highest ethical standards as they carry out their duties. All employees are made aware of their responsibilities surrounding conflicts of interest and the Values and Ethics Code for the public sector as soon as they begin their tenure with the department. It is the obligation of employees to prevent, identify, disclose, and manage any outside activities that may constitute a conflict of interest within 60 days of their hiring. And while there is no specific policy against contracting for services with current and former employees and CAF members, these contracts must be disclosed at the time of hiring and conducted in an open, fair, and transparent manner to ensure that they are free of any real or perceived conflict. To improve our processes around how employees publicly disclose potential conflicts of interest, the Deputy Minister has advised me that D&D is now rolling out a mandatory two-step screening process for all incoming employees this month. The first step requires a new hire to sign a mandatory affirmation in their letter of offer. This affirmation includes a series of questions to determine whether a conflict of interest could exist. If an employee answers yes to any of these questions, They are expected to provide a full declaration in a confidential report to the Review Services Branch within 30 days. The department will then investigate the situation to analyze and manage the conflict of interest risk. We're also piloting new mandatory conflict of interest questionnaire for existing employees. Last month, this questionnaire was sent to 292 of our procurement members of the material group for completion. It will be expanded across the defense team in the coming weeks. While these new processes were not in place when Mr. Yeo was hired, he was still obligated to disclose any potential conflict of interest within 60 days of beginning his employment in the department. National Defense only received his declaration on March 3rd, which was 165 days into his tenure, and after he was suspended from his position. He subsequently resigned from the Federal Public Service 1 day before he was to discuss his employment with DND. And following the issues around his appointment coming to light, both the Public Service Commission and the National Defense have completed investigations into his employment. Neither of these investigations have suggested error, favoritism, or improper conduct related to the hiring process. However, we're committed to applying lessons learned from this incident to improve our conflict of interest processes, to strengthen our approach to contracting national defense and across the entire public service. I want to assure the members of this committee we take any real or potential conflicts of interest at national defense very seriously. My expectation as minister is that all actions that take place in my department will meet the highest ethical standards. And we know the Canadians expect openness, transparency, and accountability from their government. Thank you very much, Mr. Chair.
Sir, open our first round. The first 4 members will each have 6 minutes each. Mr. January, you have the floor for 6 minutes, please.
Minister, this week's Auditor General reveals how much Liberals love McKinsey, but especially those at National Defense. National Defense gave 15 contracts to McKinsey, 13 of which were non-competitive. In addition to breaking all kinds of rules, these contracts have gone to a company that is simultaneously working with the militaries of our strategic adversaries. Did you ever inquire about which other militaries McKinsey is working for around the world?
Indicated, officials perhaps could give you that information. I am not involved in the contracting process, but I would like to share with you.
Sir, if I can just clarify, it was a very specific question about actions you've taken as minister. Have you ever inquired? The McKinsey story has been in the news, right? You will have seen it. Did you ever inquire about which other militaries McKinsey is working for at the same time as working for the Canadian Department of National Defense?
Thank you. And with respect to the steps that they've taken, I'm happy to share with you. We've reduced the government use of professional services by 15% since I've taken over. We've ended the standing offers with McKinsey and all similar companies, and we've introduced stricter requirements for departments to make suppliers more transparent and accountable.
Okay, that wasn't the question.
I've never engaged with anyone from McKinsey. I've never talked to anyone there.
Okay.
And so I haven't got the information you seek, but one of my colleagues, perhaps Mr. Crosby, might have that information.
Have you ever asked your officials or sought information about which other militaries around the world McKinsey works for?
No.
Okay. Do you think you should have? Do you think that's important information? Do you think that's germane to the fact that they're also working for the Canadian Armed Forces?
My expectation is that our very professional and capable public service and people responsible for the procurement of these contracts would exercise due diligence in ensuring that with whomever we contract with meet our ethical and security requirements.
Well, can either of the public officials answer here? Very briefly, has the Department of Defense ever gotten information from McKinsey regarding which other militaries they're working with around the world? It's just a yes or a no.
Mr. Chair, the way we approach this is not to inquire what other work they have necessarily, but to ensure that the companies meet the security requirements checklist.
Okay, so the answer is no.
We don't go and pursue what other business they have. It's a large multinational. We ensure that they have the right.
Okay, yeah. So I guess this is a policy question, and it comes back to you, Minister, who's responsible for the direction here. When McKinsey has done particularly well from this government, but overwhelmingly from National Defense, 13 non-competitive contracts, we've seen the Auditor General's report that McKinsey has been favored by this government significantly. At the same time, we know in a limited way, not fully, but we know that McKinsey is engaged actively with our strategic adversaries around the world. That doesn't mean that they're sharing specific privileged information, but they're learning things from us that those same associates are applying in their interactions with foreign militaries. At a policy level, do you think this is good policy to not make these inquiries?
I think it's very good policy that anyone contracting with the Canadian government and the Department of National Defence either in competitive process or through standing offers, that they be subject to and meet the rigorous security standards that we put in place.
But should those include inquiries into who else they're working for at the same time?
Well, frankly, if there was any indication in that security review and screen that is put in place that indicated that that was a concern, my expectation that would be brought to light.
Yeah. Well, I think that's a fundamental concern, but I'll move.
Okay.
I think we've heard your position. You've heard mine. It's a policy disagreement, and Canadians can make their judgment about whether that's a problem. This committee's heard from Mr. Yao, employee at National Defence, at the same time as his company was getting contracts from the government. Our view is that, aside from the particular problems of his case, we don't think that it makes sense to have someone who is an employee of the government who is also being contracted out to for certain work. If they're an employee, the purpose of contracting out is that the skills to do that activity don't exist within government. So why would you contract out to someone who's also a government employee? Which is why we put forward a motion to this committee that was passed, though opposed by the Liberal members, that was passed, calling on the government to end any of these double-dipping arrangements where a government employee is also a recipient of government contracts. Do you believe that the Department of National Defence should end all instances of double-dipping?
Perhaps you're not aware that a significant number of the members of the Canadian Armed Forces are reservists. By the very definition of their work, they are also employed in other occupations. Some of them are police officers or firemen. Some of them are electricians.
Let's set aside the reservist question, because I think that there's a particular situation.
That's a situation where they are both.
Yeah. So I have limited time. Let's set that aside. I understand that there's a particular case there of reservists, people that are full-time employees of your department, and also benefits of contract. Do we think we should end all double dipping in those cases?
Well, I think what we should do is ensure that all of the rules with respect to the declaration of conflict of interest are clearly articulated, and that appropriate measures are put in place.
But if you have a declaration and the conflict of interest persists, declaring something doesn't change that there's a conflict of interest. If the conflict of interest persists, why don't we just end the conflict of interest by ending double dipping?
And respectfully, there's a spectrum of potential conflicts of interest. Some of those risks can be mitigated. Some of them require a full screen. Some of them would be an absolute prohibition from engaging in any contracts with the department. So it's a range. It really depends on the position the person holds and the services that they may be providing. There is an appropriate response. I am absolutely concerned that in this case, this individual did not meet those screening requirements. We've put some very rigorous steps in place in direct response to the recommendations of the Auditor General to make sure that does not happen again. And when it
Thank you, Minister. I'm afraid that is the time. I allowed
Thank you, Mr.
extra
Chair.
time for you to answer it. Turning now to Ms. Khalid. You have the floor for 6 minutes, please.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you to our witnesses today. I'll start just to clarify, Mr. Crosby, how many contracts do you have with McKinsey currently?
We have no active contracts with McKinsey at this time.
Thank you. I appreciate that. Now, Minister Blair, thank you so much for taking the time to be here today. And I realize that you were not the minister for this while during the active dates that we're discussing today. But, Minister, during his testimony, Conservative card-carrying member Mr. Yao had a lot of interesting stories about what he did both as a member of the Canadian Armed Forces and when he was a contractor while he was flashing his Conservative badge to all of us here. To the best of your knowledge, can you please clarify exactly what he did during his time at National Defence?
If I may clarify one point, I was in fact the Minister of Defence when the Auditor General report came to light and through the work of parliamentary committees. Within 24 hours of that information becoming known, Mr. Yao was suspended, and steps were being taken to deal with his employment. He resigned before that could be completed, but he was suspended and out of the building within 24 hours of that information coming to light, and I was, in fact, the minister at that time.
So to clarify, when you became aware of the accusations made against Mr. Yao, you took steps right away.
Well, in fairness, the deputy minister took the steps. Deputy Minister Matthews at that time took those immediate steps, and because he is the department head and was responsible for those actions. I was advised of the actions that he took. I certainly supported it, it didn't require my authority for the deputy minister. The deputy minister acted very, very quickly and appropriately in this case.
Thank you for that, and I think we can all at this table agree that that the specific case of Mr. Yao should not have happened at all. So since that incident has happened, have there been any steps that you or your deputy minister have taken to prevent these types of actions from happening in the future?
Yes, ma'am. And there are a number of, I think, very important steps that we've taken. We've introduced much stricter requirements around suppliers being much more transparent. As I've said, we're strengthening our conflict of interest code for public servants. We've taken very seriously the Auditor General's report, and we're putting into action some of the recommendations that we've put. I've already articulated that the questionnaire, the new questionnaire that's being provided. If the answer is yes to any of the 6 questions put to a new employee, they must submit a more detailed conflict of interest statement within 30 days. But we're also, and I think this is important, we're strengthening the training for our officials. Sometimes the regimes around conflict of interest are not always well understood. And so we're strengthening the training for our officials so that they'll be able to more readily comply with the requirements and the expectation of all Canadians, but also for management personnel so that they would, be more alert to some of the challenges, the steps that could be taken to mitigate any potential conflict, and how to make sure that we are maintaining and protecting the integrity of our procurement processes, our businesses within our departments as well.
I think that's so important. I mean, when we talk about taxpayer dollars, we have to maintain the utmost respect for every single penny that we spend as a government or as parliamentarians as well. So I really appreciate that. Deputy Beck, you're new to your current role. Congratulations on taking it up. But you're not new to the world of D&D. You previously served as the Associate Deputy Minister, is that correct? Yep. So I wanted to give you a chance to explain how you will ensure compliance with ethics and conflict of interest regime for public servants within your department.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much for the opportunity. And what I would like to stress is how much I plan to build on the excellent work done by my predecessors, notably just in the past few months and weeks. And in addition to what the minister has outlined with some very new proposals around the code of conflict and a requirement within a certain time frame for new employees to respond, we're also creating a new oversight committee of procurement that will have a much more detailed and deliberate review of every contract that is over a certain amount. And of course, the training that the minister referred to. At the moment, what we have is a process whereby staff are trained before they get there, for instance, their financial delegation. This tends to be at a moment in time. What we're looking at for the future is a more regular, routine, repetitive set of training requirements rather than a one-off, and then we just hope that the person continues to deliver as they should.
I appreciate that, and I realize that the majority of our public service are very honorable people, and they work very, very hard to take care of Canadians, and especially during the pandemic, we saw just how much they went above and beyond. So, where I say that, I also want to kind of dive a little bit deeper into holding people to account.
Ms. Cleary, I'm afraid that that would be a brief question. You're almost out of time.
How would you hold public servants to account if they find themselves with a conflict of interest?
When such conflicts arise, it is incumbent upon the member themselves in order to declare that conflict. And if they have failed to meet the standards, I think there has to be high levels of accountability. I think Canadians expect that of us. I've always been very mindful. I've had a number of jobs in my life where I've been responsible for spending the public's money. And I always thought it was incumbent upon us to make sure that we be as transparent and open with them to ensure that they're getting good value. And when there are issues where someone does not follow the rules, there has to be consequences.
Thank you.
Serious and public.
Thank you, Minister. Suivant, c'est Madame Sécla Desgagnés. Vous avez parlé pour 6 minutes.
Hello, Mr. Minister. Thank you for having accepted our invitation. Could you give me the date that Mr. Yeo quit his job?
And, I may turn to one of our officials, but
Juste la date, s'il vous plaît.
I believe it was March of this year. As I said, he was suspended immediately. Excuse me, and I have Isabel with me. It was March 5th. But he was suspended immediately, become this information. He was scheduled to come in to deal with his employment, and he resigned on March 5th.
Merci. Par contre,
Thank you. I understand that after there was media reports and the Auditor General report was on February 7th. It took a month before he quit. But what I'm trying to specify here is you were minister when Mr. Yeo was hired. When Mr. Yeo was hired, he was working for the public service, working for DND, and he came before the AUGO committee, the government operations. He testified as he was an employee of National Defense. He was testifying on Dalian. He was there as the CEO for Dalian, and he was also a civil servant. So, I mean, here's a question with regards to different departments where you've worked. At what frequency were you discussing, Mr. Sofsky? During this period of the RFCAN audit, but during the period where you were Minister for Public Safety and Mr. Osefsky was president of the agency, how often did you discuss?
fréquence, pardon.
I had a number of discussions with the president of CBSA at that time, but as I hope as I made clear in my opening remarks, I was not in any way involved in any of the HR practices, the hiring or firing of employees. That is the responsibility of the deputy minister or deputy minister head of their organization. And similarly, I was not involved in the issuance of any contracts with, because when in my ministerial position.
Simplement.
So, what is relevant here is that it's not just one thing that went badly. There are many things successive things that went badly at DND, and we tell ourselves, well, there's a responsibility for deputy ministers, for employers that are civil servants, but there's also departmental responsibility, accountability, and that's up to you. And you were Minister of Public Safety as well, and everything that happened under RFCAN when you were Minister for Public Safety, and there was CBSA, and it's your accountability that is in question. Now, as to the frequency of contacts that you had with Mr. Sofsky, this brings me to wonder, are you aware or have you talked about issues? The alerts that were saying that there were issues at CBSA, there was a whistleblower that were talking about a generalized corruption where you're minister. Did you hear about these allegations as to a whistleblower? No. An important element is that Butler submitted his official complaint in September 2021, and you were still Minister at Public Safety in September 2021. Did Mr. Sofsky or did anyone from CBSA inform on the minister responsible on this complaint mentioned by Butler?
Your question is no. I would point out that we were in what is often referred to as a caretaker convention because the election campaign and the writ had been dropped in September of 2021. However, I did not have any conversation. I was throughout that entire period of time the Minister of Public Safety, but I did not have any conversation with the president of CBSA, Mr. Ozowski, during that period of time with respect to that issue.
Mais sachant que vous êtes ministre responsable, ne croyez-vous pas?
But knowing that you were the minister responsible, and thank you for your direct answers, but don't you think that the minister responsible normally should be aware when important complaints, especially when you have whistleblower complaints? There was Mr. Savoy with issues with CBSA. His pension wasn't paid for years, whether it be Bottler complaining about CBSA. Don't you think that a minister should be aware of this type of information? And I'm asking this question truly as a veteran minister, if I can say that, an experienced minister. Don't you think it should be ministerial responsibility of a minister?
First of all, I am not the deputy lead of CBSA. That was, in fact, Mr. Ozowski, and that was it was his job. However, let me be very clear as well, as a rather senior minister of government, my expectation is I am always responsible what takes place within the organizations or agencies under my ministerial authority, but I don't have authority with respect to personnel matters that you've referred to, and unfortunately at that time that information was not brought to my attention.
Parce que justement, comme membre senior de votre gouvernement, c'est
So it's one thing that we're seeing now. We're seeing this throughout the government, and it's really a shame. We see the same thing with sustainable technology. The government seems to be losing control of agencies, losing control about what's happening fundamentally within departments. And we're wondering if the ministers even know what's happening on a daily basis within their departments. And this is throughout. And at DND, according to the AG report, 50% of true conflicts of interest that were found by the Auditor General, 50% are coming from the Department of Defense. And you mentioned many different issues on conflict of interest and regulations, but this is quite a disastrous observation for DND. So what do you think about this last report? And if we're talking about McKinsey in particular.
Well, first of all, I have never, as a minister of government, ever directed anyone or authorized anyone to disobey the rules, the very strong and rigorous and appropriate and necessary rules that are in place for the conduct of the business of each of our departments. But when the Auditor General does her very important work in identifying deficiencies in the way that work is being done, it is the responsibility of the minister, in this case, to ensure that the departments respond in an appropriate way. And as I've already articulated, I won't waste the committee's time by going over it again. But we listen very carefully. You're welcome, sir. We listen very carefully to the auditor's report, and we've taken action in response to the deficiencies that she identified, which I think is my responsibility, and I've shared with this committee that we have acted.
Thank you, Minister. I wanted to allow for a fulsome response to that question. Mr. Desjardins, you have the floor for 6 minutes, please.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and I do want to thank the Minister for being present with us today on what is a really important issue. Several audits now in the Public Accounts Committee have come forward, not just in ArriveCan, but more recently in the McKinsey study that looked at the very large issue of contracting, subcontracting, this shadow network of consultants that are like bugs to a rotting meal in so many ways, that they're in this environment continuously seeking contracts from the government, and at many times even create massive networks that become layers of subcontractors, layers and layers and layers. And multiple reports, including the ArriveCan study presented by the Auditor General, suggest that this network has largely been able to, one, take advantage of the PSPC rules, and in some instances there was many cases actually where there was the awarding of non-competitive contracts. In your ministry, there has been instances of non-competitive contracts being issued at very large sums. Why would your ministry, in any case, look towards non-competitive contracts?
There are some limited circumstances, and as I've said, 95% of all of the contracts we've signed at D&D are done through a competitive process. Mm-hmm. But it is the nature of, frankly, the work that we do at Department of National Defense that there are occasions when there are very limited options and there's some urgency. to signing contracts. And at the same time, that does not abrogate the responsibility to follow the rules and to be open and transparent. But there are some very limited circumstances where a non-competitive process is the appropriate way to get done what is required.
No, I appreciate that. But you would have to also accept that same truth to be a truth of having to accept the inherent risk of doing a non-competitive contract, correct?
Well, and there is inherent risk, but I think risk has to be managed, and it has to be managed through rigorous adherence
And that
to the
brings me to my
policies
next
and processes
question.
that are put in place.
If in fact there is risk present, what checks and balances can you, internal checks and balances, especially in regards to the ArriveCan situation, does your ministry undertake, or if any?
Well, and if I may, I think I've actually spent some time going over some of the things that we do and the things that we put in place. I may, because I've got an incredibly experienced procurement minister, perhaps turn to Troy.
Maybe actually before you answer, if you can also answer one more question, because I know you've been here before, Mr. Cosby, on some of this. In relation to the Auditor General's report, it suggests that some of these contracts, to which I hope you can comment on, were also susceptible to security breaches. Are you aware of the Auditor General's report in regards to security breaches? And has the ministry done any work to review any potential breaches, security breaches, pertaining to any contract, including competitive ones?
Two answers for
Yeah, please.
On work that's been done most recently, and this is coming out of reviews by the Office of the Procurement Ombudsman, by our internal review services, and most recently by the Auditor General, is strengthening our contract compliance framework. To begin with, the best way to mitigate risk here is to plan well in advance and ensure that we have the time to put the right processes and procedures in place. So there's a planning element to this. Then there's sampling to make sure that we're looking across the contracting that we're doing. The Department of National Defense, in any given fiscal year, issues in the order of 145,000 contracts. So there's a sampling approach to do this. We have a way of looking at higher risk contracts to ensure that we're looking across the board, plus some random sampling. And then there's reporting and governance on the performance against those reviews so that we're continuously learning. So we're strengthening that contract compliance framework and building out the team now so that we can, in light of what we've learned, ensure that we're going to incorporate those lessons into our policies, our procedures, and our training.
What about, in addition to those enhancements, to have a more strenuous and better internal checks on these contracts? Has at any point in the discussions you've had, particularly to Minister Blair, with cabinet officials or other members, to actually look at hiring more public servants? You know, we've seen in the Auditor General's report on ArriveCan that there's a savings of 6-1, that in some instances that there were contracts given to private firms where that work could have been done by the public service. And that probably hurts a lot of folks in our public service who know that they have the skills and they want to do the work, but it takes the Auditor General to confirm that truth. And to that point, will you confirm or commit to the fact that public servants should be doing the work and you should just reduce the expenditure on private contracting? And I'll make one last point before you can respond. I had your former deputy minister here, Bill Matthews, present, and they spent a whopping $5.1 billion in contracting last year. That's almost double. That is more than double what you pay the public service. Like, what explanations can you have for Canadians that are concerned about their security, concerned about work by the public service, and taxpayer savings?
Thank you very much. And I think they're important questions. I've already acknowledged. I think we have an extraordinary professional public service, and I very much value their work.
Why not give them the work?
Well, and if I may, some of the professional contracts that Mr. Matthews shared with this committee or a committee previously, some of those contracts are for services, for example, the maintenance of certain vehicles or ships or planes. The public service does not have the capability.
Why not?
Well, but again, I think it's appropriate to find the best way, the most cost-effective way of getting the job done. And there are.
This is not the most cost-effective way, Mr. Blair. With all due respect, it's costing twice the cost of the public service.
Well, and again, the public service may not have the capability, and I suppose we could.
You're talking about repairing vehicles. I think they can.
And gentlemen, however, that is the time. I'm going to move on, begin the second round. Mr. Brock, you have the floor for 5 minutes, please.
Minister Blair, welcome. Minister, do you know how much the Department of National Defense spends on management, consulting contracts last year?
I don't have that number available to me, but I've got some pretty good people who may have that information. Brian?
Approximately $73 million.
That's correct. It's exactly $73 million. We asked your department to furnish us with details, and that's the response that we got. $73 million when men and women of our services are couch surfing, lining up at food banks, money not spent on boots, money not spent on equipment. There is indeed a morale crisis with our service personnel. And to make matters worse, we learned that Canada, at any given point in time, has enough ammunition to last about 3 days. Does that concern you, Minister?
Yeah, of course. As a matter of
It
fact,
should.
and I would refer you to the new defense policy update, Our North Strong and Free, that I just released, where we actually articulated those concerns and the investments that we needed to make. And by the way, the money to do that, to invest in for example, ammunition production and provide the money for long-term contracts is in that document, but it's also in the 2024 budget.
Thank you.
And so
Thank you, Minister. I got to move on.
I share your
My
concern.
time is very limited. I appreciate your response. So I got a list of all these middlemen contractors. These are contractors who are retained by the Government of Canada to ultimately hire professionals. And surprisingly, one of the entries is from SNC-Lavalin, the company that was mired in controversy not too long ago, facing bribery, corruption, and fraud charges, ultimately put pressure so much on the Prime Minister and his staff that would lead to another conviction of ethical violations. They would be probably the last person the Government of Canada would want to align itself with, yet SNC-Lavalin got $115,000. So the question is very simple. Why did taxpayer monies of $115,000 go to this company?
Well, and again, I don't know that particular contract, and I don't know whether my officials would have that information, but I'd invite them to provide it if you require it.
Officials?
I don't have the details on that contract.
What did SNC-Lavalin do? You don't have details?
Sure,
To
Mr.
provide us
Chair,
with details?
when the dates were when that contract was in place.
Last year.
But we can look it up.
It was last year.
And as Troy mentioned, we're talking about an incredibly large number.
Yeah,
of
I got to
contracts
move
that
on,
they-
Minister.
So
I
having the
appreciate
particular
that.
details of one of them.
I appreciate that. I'm looking at this list. It's roughly 3 pages. They're either corporations, limited corporations. The identity is pretty much explanatory as to what they do. Yet there is one entry for an individual by the name of Melanie Randall. Would she be a Liberal donor or affiliated with the Liberal Party of Canada?
Melanie Randall is.
Well, Melanie Randall received $137,812.49 of taxpayer funds. I know I certainly want to know, and I'm sure all Canadians want to know, why a certain individual has received a pretty significant contract. I'd like to know who she is, what she did for this government, and what value has Canadians received. You'll provide that to me, Mr. Crosby?
Yes, we can do that, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Here's another big one. Pardon the pun, because the name is Big Rideau Leadership Services. Last year they got $14,000. Do you know what they did?
Not specifically, Mr. Chair.
Do you know where they work from?
I'm not specifically aware. I've heard of the name of the contractor before.
Well, we did a search, and Big Rideau Leadership Services works in a residential area just outside of Ottawa on 6 Brandy Creek Crescent, likely working out of their home office or basement, just like the infamous GC Strategies.
Point of order,
which-
Chair. I'm just concerned about personal information being given out about individuals. I don't know where this is going, but
Public domain.
you know, we know that Mr. Yeo was a conservative donor, but you know, I don't really see where
Point
this
of order
is
on
going.
that point of order, Chair.
Yes, Mr. Brock.
Okay. We're going to correct the record once and for all because both Ms. Shanahan and Ms. Khalid are misrepresenting the evidence that this
Point of
committee
order,
had
Chair.
heard.
That's
I've got the
really-
floor, Chair.
Point of order, Chair.
Got the
I'll
floor.
hear you in just 1 second.
Are both misrepresenting the evidence of Mr.
Chair,
Yao.
I'm sorry, I cannot
Mr.
allow
Yao
those kind of comments to stand,
presented
Chair.
a
My
donor
apologies,
card,
Chair, I
Okay,
can't
thank you.
get
not
those
a
comments to
membership
stand.
card
All right.
from the
Absolutely.
Conservative
Remember
Party
the
of Canada.
translators. Okay, thank you, Mr. Brock. You've made your point. Ms. Khalid, you have a point of order?
Not anymore, Chair.
Okay. So, Mr. Brock, you have just literally a few
I
seconds.
got one question left.
In a few seconds, so no preamble, please. Please ask
Yeah.
the question.
How many millions of taxpayer funds have been shoveled to consultants working out of their basement?
We don't shovel taxpayer dollars anywhere.
Paid out to consultants working out of their
that's an
basement.
entirely
Mr.
different
Brock, your time is up, and I heard a response from the minister, so I'm going to move to Ms. Shanahan for 5 minutes, please.
Thank you very much, Chair. And yes, moving to the topic at hand, Minister, you mentioned in your opening statements that some new actions around conflict of interest declaration and compliance processes have been put in place for new hires. Can you or your officials provide us with more details on when those measures will be rolled out across the department?
It's actually happening. Thank you very much, Brenda. It's happening right now. The new the training for our public officials, for example, for the people that we already have on has, and I'm being told that the answer to this is on tab 4. The process of all are being applied. They're being rolled out this month, all right across the board. But we've already begun the training for our people to make sure that they're aware of the new rules and the expectation, and the mandatory affirmation requirement is going to be part of all future letter of offers. So we put those measures in place now. The work was done very quickly by the department because they have had the benefit of the Auditor General's recommendations, and I think they've responded quite appropriately to make sure that not only are we maintaining high ethical standards in these procurement processes, but that it can be done transparently to be able to assure Canadians that we're being careful with their money.
Well, thank you very much for that, Minister, because I think, yes, all members of this committee were definitely seized with the issue of conflict of interest in a, as it was a, we understood from the testimony that we heard that it was still common practice for members, including members of the Canadian Armed Forces, to do work in a private capacity as well as still working for the CAF. And but it was certainly with the testimony, the very disturbing testimony that we heard from Mr. Yeo on so many different levels, that really shed a light on these practices and that they need to be tightened up. So when you say that these measures apply to CAF members, and in an earlier question you referred to reservists, could we have some clarity around, what kind of supervision or monitoring, if you will, because I understand that it can be quite fluid how members will move in and out of the CAF and the reserve forces.
It can be. We're really talking about making sure that those who are in a position of, for example, applying for contracts or approving contracts, understand the rules around conflict of interest. I think that's critically important. By the way, you asked for a date. In May, we actually sent out a new questionnaire to 292 of the procurement members within the material group under Mr. Crosby's leadership to make sure that they're aware of the new requirements and new procedures. It's not unusual, for example, for members of the Canadian Armed Forces, particularly those who are serving in our reserves, to have other lines of employment. It's kind of the nature of employment these days. Many people have a number of different occupations or
And
things
would
that they're
that be,
pursuing.
Minister, because they have different specialties or
And
expertise?
that
Yeah.
is possible. But what is never negotiable is where a conflict of interest exists, where someone may be in a decision-making position with respect to a contract. They should declare their conflict very clearly up front. We have, obviously, with Mr. Yeo, had circumstances where that was not followed and that was not done. And so we put some additional processes in place. We're now, for example, to every new hire, we're putting 6 questions to them about any potential conflict, not only for themselves, but for family members or any element of their occupation. If the answer is yes to any of those, that then triggers a next round of steps. It is the responsibility of the employee to declare a conflict, but we're making sure that they have all the information that they require and that the department can make good decisions with respect to managing the risk of any conflict. Some of those conflicts can be mitigated. Some of them have to be screened, and some of them would require a complete prohibition from the person having any engagement in these matters. We need to get that information from them, and we are prepared to take the steps. I think it's really important that we be able to demonstrate that we are acting quickly to respond to the concerns that the Auditor General has raised with us. As well, I think there's some very important work taking place at Treasury Board, of which our department is part, but we're not solely part of it, that the government, through the Treasury Board, is also enacting a number of really important measures to ensure the integrity and the transparency of all of our procurement processes.
I'm afraid
thank
that
you
is
for
the
that,
time.
Minister.
Thank you very much. Suivant, c'est Madame Sinclair Desgagnés.
Mrs. Sinclair Desgagnés. Thank you. Mr. Minister, when you talk about 95% of contracts are given in a non-competitive fashion, you're talking about 95% with regards to the total amount of contracts awarded or the number? So it is the amount or the number?
There, it's the exact opposite. 95% are awarded under a competitive
Oui,
process.
En termes de montant total ou en termes de nombre de contrats?
Total number or total amount?
D'accord.
I'm basing that on advice I just received.
Parfait. En termes de nombre de contrats?
Number of contracts. So when we look at the McKinsey report on the way that several contracts were awarded in a non-competitive way, we often see that the justification was in the case, for example, it was less than 40,000. However, what the Auditor General saw is that there was a practice that is more and more common at different departments, is that the first contract might be a small amount, but then there are several contracts afterwards, and the totals are quite large. The first contract, a value of 22,000, so we can say, okay, but then 3 subsequent contracts, and the total here for one service, $5 million, and this was done in a non-competitive way. So the rules were, they've gone around the rules by saying, oh, it's a small amount. Then several contracts were awarded to provide a service at $5 million. Can this type of practice continue at DND?
Well, as I said in my earlier remarks, all of the standing offers with McKinsey and all other similar companies have been ended. And so those standing officers are concluded. We're not going to continue with that. With respect to the actual mechanics of the procurements that you've just spoken to, if I may, I would turn to my colleague, Mr. Crosby.
The scenario that you've described in your question is a possibility, and in some cases it's justified and genuine that work will reveal the requirement for additional work scope. But they are considered riskier procurements, and in our contract compliance oversight framework and with the oversight that we're putting in place, those types of contract expansion or continuations would be flagged and require additional oversight.
Brièvement, très brièvement.
Very briefly. Well, I don't have the time to start another question. Okay, thank you.
You have the floor for 2.5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. Minister Blair, I want to describe to you and paint a picture of a scenario, and you tell me the logical solution to it. Now imagine there's an operable clinic that you're in charge of. At that clinic, let's say there's 5 healthcare professionals. let's say those healthcare professionals are having a lot of work going on there. They're feeling like they may be undercompensated for their work. The solution to that, in some people's mind, may be to ensure that their working conditions are fair. But what if it became the recommendation of the person in charge of that place to actually hire a specialized group, another private company, to then hire other persons that could replace the job of that healthcare professional at a higher rate to fill the vacancy there? Wouldn't it be more logical in your mind to just better support the public servants that are working there now?
Yeah, let me be very clear. I'm in complete agreement that we need to ensure that we support the public service that do really important work for us.
You're saying that, Minister Blair, but the thing is, the situation I painted is a real situation happening under your watch. There are healthcare professionals on bases right now who are not being paid equitably or fairly. And the government's response is too bad, so sad. And then they've actually hired a contractor, Calian. Are you familiar with the company Calian?
I'm not.
Calian has been asked as a professional service finder to then look for replacement workers. Those replacement workers are taking the jobs of healthcare professionals that are already operating on base. Worse yet, they're getting paid at a higher rate, get paid more benefits, get paid over working holidays, and have far more access to a work-life balance than those who are in the public service. Don't you think that that's a disservice to the public service? So how can they take seriously your claim that you really value them when their jobs are being taken away, subcontracted away to Calian, who is now hiring public sector health workers, bringing them into the private system, and we're paying as taxpayers a premium?
Well,
how is that fair?
And first of all, Blake, I'm not familiar with the circumstances you described.
Well, maybe your officials are? It's a pretty large case.
Listen, give me that information and I'll look into it for you, because I think it's really important. First of all, I have a responsibility. Every member of the Canadian Armed Forces is exempt from the Canada Health Act. It is my responsibility to make sure that we provide them with adequate health care. And I want to make sure that we do.
Can you commit to ending the contracting of private healthcare workers in our public?
Well, as I've
away from our
shared with
public
you,
service?
I don't have that information right now. What I would do is, please share it with me, and I'll look into it.
Thank you. That
Certainly.
is the time for that round. Next up is Mr. Nader for 5 minutes, please.
Thank you, Chair, and through you, Chair, thank you, Minister, for joining us here this afternoon. Just to quickly preempt the potential Liberal gotcha moment that they may want to share in their next round when they try to wave around David Yo's membership card. They would know that Mr. Yo's membership became disactive and non-active the moment he ran for a different political party. So just to try to preempt their gotcha moment, it ceased to be active once our party learned of his other party. But Chair, to Minister again, thank you for joining us. First, has the RCMP contacted you directly about the Arrive Can? No. Thank you for that, Chair. When your cabinet colleague, Minister Anand, appeared before us on April 18th, she was very clear that it was the CBSA that was at fault for the Arrive Can scandal and for the cost overruns. In fact, in a response to a question from Mr. Desjardins, she said, and I'm going to quote this, it was because the CBSA did not follow the rules. Do you agree with your cabinet colleague, Minister Anand, that the CBSA is the federal agency responsible for the cost overruns with the Arrive Can scandal?
I haven't had the benefit of seeing the information that perhaps Minister Anand has, and so I'm unable to come to that conclusion in the absence of that information or evidence.
But you have read the report. You've read the Auditor General report. So would you agree that it was CBSA that was primarily responsible for the...
I would agree that there were very significant deficiencies in the control of those contracts. But actually determined that it wasn't as clear in the Auditor General's report that I read as to the assignment of responsibility or blame.
Okay, so you were the minister for a significant period of time as public safety minister, under which CBSA is responsible.
Yep.
Given the benefit of hindsight, and of course no one can predict the future, but given the benefit of hindsight, would you not agree that there were deficient processes at CBSA that allowed for this contract or allowed for this this app to be developed at a significant cost over? Would you at least accept?
Well, and John, as I've tried to make clear earlier, when I was in that position, at no time did I ever authorize anyone in any of the agencies that I was responsible for as Minister of Public Safety to disobey the rules that were in place, and they're well-articulated rules with respect to how these contracts are to be managed. And at no time, unfortunately, was I made aware of the deficiencies that the Auditor General did a good job and brought forward. But I can also tell you that in reading that Auditor General report, we have fulfilled our responsibilities to act quickly to make sure that the deficiencies are properly addressed, that people are held to account, and that we put in place appropriate measures to make sure that that does not happen again.
Would you agree then perhaps that your officials failed at that point in time? Did Mr. Ozowski fail at that time in properly ensuring that the agency had proper controls in place?
And respectfully, I don't believe I have enough information available to me to determine exactly. But as I've already indicated, the responsibility is primarily that of the deputy head of an agency, and so there is a level of responsibility there. And as I've said as well, as the Minister of Public Safety, as I then was, I also have responsibility to ensure that when these deficiencies are identified, that we respond in an appropriate way, that people are held to account, and that steps are taken to ensure that we maintain the integrity of those procurement processes.
When was the first time you learned of the existence of the company GC Strategies?
When the Auditor General came out with a report. I was not, as I've already said, I'm not involved in any of our HR or procurement processes. I don't hire and I don't authorize or approve any of those contracts.
Were you aware prior to the Auditor General's report of the concept of ghost contracting? Were you aware of that?
No, sir.
Okay. In your opening comments, you made a comment about two investigations, and I just want you to clarify this, related to David Yo's employment and contracting. Am I correct in that there were two investigations?
That's the information that I understand from the former Deputy Minister.
And who undertook those investigations?
My understanding is that they were done within the department itself.
Okay. And would you be willing to share those investigations with this committee?
They're not my investigations. The department was doing an internal review of what had taken place and the processes. They investigated those matters.
So, but it was the Department of National Defense undertook those investigations. Would the Deputy Minister be in a position to confirm whether she could share those reports with this committee?
So if I could clarify, one of them Public Service Commission about the external hiring process, and similarly a report on the hiring process from the perspective within the department.
Your time. Could those be shared with the committee?
I believe they can.
Thank you. We'll look for those. That's your time, Mr. Nader. Yeah.
You know, we also have responsibilities with respect to privacy interest in the maintaining the confidentiality of certain measures.
Yeah.
I'm sure the HR official would advise me of that.
Very good. It's now over to Ms. Yip for the last 5-minute segment. You have the floor, ma'am.
Thank you. Minister Blair, it's always a pleasure to see a colleague from Scarborough. And congratulations to Ms. Beck on your new role. And I just want to clarify something from Mr. Nader regarding Mr. David Yo's Conservative Party membership. It appears that it is an annual membership and just renewed until May 31st, 2025. So it seems to me that it's still valid. So I'd like to now ask Mr. Crosby a question. I just would like to turn to the issue of contracting out work more broadly at DND. How many contracts does DND enter into an average year?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I think I mentioned earlier, it's in the average of 145,000 contracts a year.
How many of them are the result of an open competition?
As the minister was saying, from a volume or numbers perspective, it's about 95% that are competitive.
Right, and I believe that, Minister Blair, you also mentioned that 5% were non-competitive, and it was because contracts needed or work needed to be done quickly. Is that right?
Well, if I may, I think there can be a number of reasons, valid reasons why pursuing a non-competitive process. I think quite clearly our strong preference is that they would be competitive processes. But sometimes through time constraints, sometimes because there is only one source of a particular thing that might be required, we are, in those limited circumstances, frankly, the only practical way to acquire either the service or the material that we require is to pursue a sole source contract. But again, our strong preference is to follow a competitive process.
And if I could add, Minister, there are 4 exceptions documented in the government contract regulations. We adhere to those exceptions. As the Minister mentioned, sometimes there's only one source of supply, oftentimes tied to the ownership of intellectual property that we have to respect. Other occasions, there could be an emergency requirement that played out during COVID where urgency is absolutely top of mind. But there are 4 documented government contract regulation exceptions to competition.
The committee was told last time that D&D spends almost $5 billion every year in contracts. Can you break that down for the committee?
I can break it down to an extent. The categories, and I think the Minister mentioned it earlier, the spending that really represent the bulk of that money, the large dollar values, would be for very specialized activities. For instance, the design of our new fleets of ships for the Navy. That work is coded to professional services in our financial systems. Obviously very different to what would be considered management consulting, where earlier we had mentioned about a $73 million spend for activities also under professional services, but specific to management services.
So given how large the numbers are here, how do you assess value for money in these contracts?
Value for money, Mr. Chair, is on an individual contract by contract basis. Is the market rate that we're paying appropriate to the good or services that we're acquiring? For the most part, as just discussed, we ascertain that through competition, through market pressure. And in other cases, we work with our colleagues in PSPC, for instance, and we can make comparisons with what other clients, customers are paying for similar services or goods when there are sole source requirements because of, for instance, intellectual property limitations on the procurement strategy.
What happens if we are no longer getting value for money for these contracts? What are the next steps?
If, for example, Mr. Chair, the contractor isn't actually delivering the contracted service or good, the contracts will always have clauses within them where we could work either through PSPC or when we're operating within our own contracting authorities to terminate the contracts.
That is about the time, Ms. Yip. I want to thank Minister Blair and your officials for coming in from the Department of National Defense. We appreciate your time today. I'm going to suspend this meeting for 5 minutes, allow the witnesses and the minister to exit, and then people can just stretch their leg, and we'll come back in 5 minutes. This meeting is suspended.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
session. Welcome back. Mr. Green, I see you've joined us. Nice to see you again. Thank you for being available and online. As you all know, we had a very eventful week with the tabling of 3 new Auditor General reports. I'll turn to that in a second. I just want to update the members that the Commissioner of the RCMP has confirmed his attendance here on June 18th. So that is something the members can expect. I've called this meeting to bring us up to speed. Mr. Nader, you have the floor.
Thank you, Chair. And I am going to move a motion, and we've had some offline discussions and open to more offline discussions, but I think we can come to an agreement. I'm going to read the motion, and then I'm going to. It is prepared to be emailed.
Yeah, let me just ask you this: is this something that you've worked with the clerk on that can be sent out as you begin?
It can be sent out as I begin
Okay,
speaking, and then I want to speak to it after I've read in the motion, if that, just to say a few things, and then we can
Absolutely.
go from
Yes.
there, Chair.
Yes. No, but I think Mr. Green is getting in the queue. Is it a point of order, Mr. Green? Yeah, he's in the queue. Yeah, so I see that. So over to you, Mr. Nader.
So I'm gonna say the motion. And I'm gonna say a quick word about some of the conversations where we'd be open to some options here. But the motion is as follows: given that the Auditor General's Report 6/2024 on SDTC, which revealed, quote, significant lapses in governance and stewardship of public funds and rampant conflicts of interest among SDTC board members pursuant to Standing Order 1083G, the committee commenced a study on this audit and invite the following witnesses to testify before the House adjourns for the summer. Francois-Philippe Champagne, Minister of Industry. Simon Kennedy, Deputy Minister of Innovation, Science and Economic Development, Canada. Francis Bilodeau, Assistant Deputy Minister, Innovation, Science and Economic Development, Canada. Paul Booth, Acting Chair of SDTC Canada. Ziad Ram, Acting President of Sustainable Development Technology, Canada. The anonymous whistleblower who appeared at the Industry Committee on this matter on December 11th, 2023. Privy Council Secretariat responsible for appointments. Mitch Davies, President of the National Research Council. And Conrad von Finkenstein, Ethics Commissioner, and the committee booked extra resources as required to accommodate these witness appearances. So that's the motion. Chair, do you want me to pause for a second before I offer a few quick comments? Or
No, I don't think so. I'll just check with the clerk. Have you been able to send it out, clerk? It's gone, so go ahead, Mr. Nader.
Okay. Thank you, Chair. And we have had some informal conversation on this side. I haven't had a chance to run over and speak with the Liberal counterparts, but I think if we could come to an agreement on this, I think we could get this done relatively quickly, both in terms of the vote, but also the study before we rise for summer. Specifically, I think if there would be an agreement to host one of these 2-hour meetings in our normal time slot, and then with additional resources have a second 1-hour meeting. I'm open to suggestions on the day, and I know colleagues might have a suggestion of where those extra resources might be. But if we can come to an agreement on that, I think we could move forward on this fairly quickly. And I'm open to conversations on this. But I think the priority would be try to get this done with these priority witnesses before the House rises for the summer.
Thank you very much. I will continue to scan the room looking for speakers, or people that want to speak to the motion. Mr. Green, you have the floor, please.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. And this feels a little bit like Groundhog Day. I had a chance to sit in committee with some of the members that are in this committee and earlier today. And this one kind of feels like the never-ending story, Mr. Chair. I guess you guys are into your, 6th hour or something like that today? There seems to be a lot of hours in this committee that are piling up here. Look, the truth is I'm keenly interested in seeing, asking some really tough questions and seeing exactly what transpired with SDTC. Those that have followed along in ethics will know that to be the case. This is something that we've delved into, and I'm sure we're going to revisit, as tends to be the habit of our conservative friends, to bring these types of motions to all committees they sit at. And in fact, as I referenced, some of these members are here today. So again, as well kind of documented in my time on ethics, I am unwilling to support this kind of blank check of available resources as necessary. You know, we have 25 members. We're all very stretched on our committee work, and I'm sitting in for somebody, so I'm not willing to commit their time as they're in travel right now. So what I'd like to do, Mr. Chair, is amend the motion, because I do support it in principle. We do, as do Democrats, support it, to strike the section of available resources and replace it with in regularly scheduled meetings, during regularly scheduled meetings. So that's the amendment that I'd like to propose. It's very similar to amendments that I've proposed that these members will be familiar at in our ethics committee, and is in keeping with the way that we're treating the rest of this session. I'll just say in close, Mr. Williamson, that we are in the final weeks of this session. This is certainly something that has been on the dockets for quite some time. It's definitely important. New Democrats believe it is important to provide accountability on this file. In terms of its urgency and warranting, you know, the ability to meet in extended hours when we're already stretched with our committee responsibilities, I'm not sure is going to be wise for us. And I'll just say something that folks may or may not have taken into consideration is that there's a possibility in these upcoming weeks here with the pending strike with CBSA that our airports and travel, all types of things can go sideways over these next couple of weeks, given what's before us. So for that reason, I'm putting forward the amendment to keep it within your regularly scheduled meetings so that we can deal with it in due course. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Green, I'm just going to comment just briefly, because it's my habit to kind of flag any issues or kind of scheduling crunches. I can say right off the top, just to inform members, that we do have 2 open slots. So what Mr. Green's proposing is something that, as chair, I can certainly work with if this is the will of the committee. So thank you, Mr. Green. And I'd ask you to put your hand down. So unless you want to get in the queue again, in which case just keep it up. But I'll turn now to Madame Sécla Desgagnés. Vous avez la parole, s'il vous plaît. Puis après ça, j'ai deux membres du gouvernement.
So when you mention that there are 2 different possibilities here, what dates are you talking about? We're going to receive the RCMP here. So could you tell us when the RCMP is available? The RCMP is on June 18th. We have opened up the 13th and the 20th. June.
D'accord. Parfait. Merci pour l'information.
Great, thank you. I agree with the principle of the motion as well, and I would support the amendment of Mr. Green.
Très bien. Merci beaucoup. Suivant, it's Ms. Khalidi of the floor, please.
Thank you, Chair. I appreciate that. And I really do appreciate Mr. Green's comments because I think that we do need to be a little bit more cognizant about House resources and what our next couple of weeks look like. And I do think that we should not be coming back here on a matter that is important but is not urgent, as Mr. Green said. So I think that perhaps we can delve into what that amendment looks like in the main motion. So, Chair, with your indulgence, I'm wondering if you can suspend for a little while we see what the amended motion looks like.
I'm going to read. If there's a will, I will certainly suspend. But I think it's in the last line it says, "In the committee book extra resources as required to accommodate these witness appearances." I'm going to look for the clerk for a little guidance here. I believe it's being changed to committee book.
It's existing meeting. Like I just wrote it in my own.
Okay,
so.
Yeah, that the committee, basically the committee sits in its scheduled time.
So just, again, seeking a little bit of clarification, Chair. So if that's the case and that's the wording of the motion as, the amendment as presented, would that still give you the discretion to call meetings over the summer or unscheduled meetings on different matters?
Well, that's so as I'll just state what the standing orders state is that this committee can either be recalled by members or by the chair. this motion has no bearing on that. My ability to call a meeting is one that is stated in the standing orders. This motion, as I read it, is about commencing a study, and between now and when we rise in the next 2 weeks, to use, based on what the amendment to the motion is to sit on this study only when we are designated to sit. And by my read, just for disclosure, is that there are 2 opportunities to do that, given that we have the RCMP as confirmed for June 18th.
So, just on that then, Chair, would you be able to call a meeting on this same subject matter outside of what is being proposed in this amendment?
I might have to just check with the clerk on that, because I'd like to be guided by.
Would you like to suspend as you?
Sure, I think there is a willingness to kind of talk, so why don't, well, yeah, I'll, but I'd like to spend just for like a minute to 2 minutes. So is that okay?
That's fair, Chair.
So I'm just going to read the amendment to the motion that was provided by the NDP to me, so we're very clear. And the committee accommodate these witnesses, comma, during regular committee meetings. So I take that, just period, and so just for transparency, I take that as the meetings would be scheduled on June 13th and 20th. So, Ms. Khalid, you had the floor when we last talked to you. You asked me a question. I'll give you the answer. It's pretty much what I said before. Nothing in this motion or outside this motion, if you pass this motion or if this motion is defeated, my ability to call a meeting in the summer is in the standing orders. I do retain that. Ability, and you have the floor.
Thank you, Chair. So perhaps I just want to ask you, are you intending to call meetings over the summer?
So I am not intending to call. However, I know there's been discussions amongst the parties. I understand there's some goodwill, and I am going to do my best to have us spend as much time as possible in our ridings. But I can truthfully and honestly say I am not intending to call meetings. Okay. I believe next was Ms. Shanahan.
Oh, Mr. Green.
Oh, I do have Mr. Green, but is it's Mr. Green? I do recognize you, but you're fourth on the list. Is that okay? So we'll come back to you. So again, I want to stress we are debating the amendment to the motion. Instead of asking for extra resources, it is to schedule the time on the 13th and the 20th. Ms. Shanahan, then I have Mr. Nader, and then Mr. Green.
I'll keep it short. I think there were good faith discussions, and we certainly are in agreement with the amendment put forward by Mr. Green.
Thank you. Mr. Nader?
I'll keep it equally short. We also support the amendment.
Okay. Mr. Green, the floor is back to you, and then if there's no other interveners, we'll turn to the vote. But of course, I cannot call that vote until the debate is collapsed. You have the floor, Mr. Green.
I don't want to waste any of the goodwill, but I will say that one of the practices that we have at committees, and I used to serve on the Public Accounts Committee. I know it's a space that tends to be less partisan in its at its best operations, less partisan than most. But I would say that the practice was always to have a subcommittee that planned meetings. And I know in ethics we ran into a challenge where the chair took it upon himself, even though it's within the standing orders, to call a meeting without any consultation to anybody else, particularly opposition parties. And I would just say to you, John, that it didn't go well. So I would encourage, whether it's this committee or others, that the Conservative side, when they're chairing, understand that without consultation to the opposition parties in particular, to Bloc and the NDP, that at least from my perspective, that becomes a pretty significant problem. So I'll take you at your word that that's not the case, and look forward to seeing this motion pass so we can go back to our evenings. Thank you.
Sure. And just to bring, since you've inquired and others, this committee did at its last meeting pass and approve the first subcommittee decision, not just of my chair, but of the 44th Parliament. So it had not been a practice, but we have reinstated it as a working process, and we'll continue to do that. But as you know as well, the reason why some of these committees, the oversight committees, are chaired by opposition members is to ensure oversight, and that's why the standing rules are written the way they are. And I believe that when this chair was held by one of your former colleagues, that of course he was both cautious to exercise it, but did so diligently as well. Clerk, could you call the vote, please, then on Mr. Green's amendment to the motion?
Shall the amendment of Mr. Green be adopted? Ms. Bradford?
Yes.
Ms. Khalid? Yes. Ms. Shanahan,
Yes.
Mr. Weiler,
Yay.
Ms. Yip,
Yes.
Mr. Nader,
Yes.
Mr. Patzer,
Yes.
Mr. Brock,
Yes.
Madame Saint-Clair Desgagnés,
Oui.
Mr. Green.
Yes.
10 yeas.
So the amendment to the motion is passed. The amendment, the motion is now modified to the last line. Now reads, and the committee to accommodate these witness appearances, comma, during regular committee meetings. So that is the motion as it now stands. Is there debate, or would you like to turn to a vote? Call a vote, please, clerk.
Shall the motion of Mr. Nader as amended be adopted? Ms. Bradford,
Yes.
Ms. Khalid, Ms. Shanahan,
Yes.
Mr. Weiler, Ms. Yip,
Yes.
Mr. Nader,
Yes.
Mr. Patzer,
Yes.
Mr. Brock,
Yes.
Madame Saint-Clair Desgagnés,
Oui.
Mr. Green.
Yes.
10 yeas.
That is passed. If there's no other business, we will see you Tuesday for the study on
Net zero.
I'm just going to get the full proper title here. Next meeting will be on Tuesday, where we will consider Canadian Net Zero Emission Accountability Act 2030 Emission Reduction Plan. On that note, I will adjourn the meeting, and we will see you Tuesday.